Ted looked at the number written on the paper, and his eyes grew large. This was way more money than he had made in a year, and this guy was offering it to him for... So, what do you want to pay me for, exactly? The man in the black suit stared at him hollowly, from behind his mirrored sunglasses. He sat nonchalantly across the table in the small coffee shop that Ted had written in for the last 4 years. Ted liked the ambience here, and many of the local writers seemed to think it was a great place to read as well. Ted could see many others around him, plinking away on their MacBooks or off-the-shelf Walmart laptops as they wrote the next great American novel or the next hit screenplay. The longer the man sat there, the more Ted wished he had approached one of them instead. "It's very straightforward," the man said, his voice in cadence reminding Ted of Agent Smith in the Matrix movies. "We want to pay you for your talent. You come to our office, let us see your talent, and we pay you for it. Sounds like something you might be interested in?" Then he smiled, his lips sliding away from his perfectly artificial teeth, and Ted cringed all over. It was like a dog who'd been taught to smile, unsettling and a little alarming. But it was a lot of money. "Let me think about it," Ted hedged, and the smile slid mechanically from the man's face. He produced a business card, rising suddenly and holding it out. "Let us know if you change your mind. The offer's valid whenever you're ready." He left then, making his way for the door like a shark hunting for its next meal. Ted looked at the card and wrinkled his eyebrows. It was a plain white business card, nothing fancy, with the words "Libris Talent," because your talent should never go to waste. Ted looked at it for a while as his laptop screen went into sleep mode, darkening and allowing him to see himself as he sat in contemplation. How very curious. Ted had been writing in some form or another for his whole life. When he was a kid, he drew pictures and created games for his friends to play. Ted's pictures, his mother swore, always told a story, and his games were never the haphazard mess that his friends often concocted. People who weren't even part of Ted's friend circle often came to join their games, and they were both fun and engaging in a way that was hard for a child to explain. His teachers praised his creativity and expected that he would do great things one day. As Ted grew, so grew his stories. By the time he was in middle school, Ted's work with fantasy was often entered into writing contests and local student work projects. His playground games had evolved into role-playing games, and when Ted was 12, he discovered the fantasy world of Dungeons & Dragons. He began a lifelong love affair with the game, and he took to the role of game master quickly. Ted's campaigns were immersive, his characters engaging, and his adventures never fell victim to the problems his friends usually encountered. Ted wrote well, and again, the adults in his life often praised him, expecting great things from him in the future. It had been a no-brainer for Ted to start studying writing after high school. He had soared through what is normally a very trying time for teens by channeling his churning emotions into his medium. Ted had gotten more than one scholarship for writing, and as college loomed, he put all of his efforts into his work. Ted spent the next 4 years working on a BA in English and Literature, and in the end, he felt he had the expected tools to begin plying his craft professionally. Now, however, Ted was trying to figure out how to turn his talent into a paycheck so he could pay his bills. Magazines liked his work, but wanted a writer with more experience. There were people online who would pay for his stories, but not enough to live off. Agents were interested, but they didn't want to take a chance on someone so young. Ted's writing was always well received, but there was always the ever-present but hanging at the end of all those praises. A few interested publishers had approached him, but it was always the sort that buried the line of price amidst all the talk. Ted was 26, 4 years out of college, self-published, untried, and no one was willing to take a chance on him. No one except Libris Talent, that was. Ted Googled them, of course. He had been burned too many times before and wanted to see what he was in store for if he decided to take their offer. Their website was professional, but ultimately soulless. Their credentials were numerous, but were presented without any real pride. This soulless corporation wanted another book for their accolades, another pet writer for their trophy case. If Ted signed on with them, he would be just another soulless shill who writes for nothing but a paycheck. Ted's phone buzzed. He looked down and sighed as he saw a message from the power company. His check had bounced again, and they were going to shut his power off at the end of the month if he didn't come up with some kind of money. That likely meant that Mr. Capish, his boss at the gas station, had given them bad checks again. He would never admit it, and this likely meant that Ted wouldn't get paid until the end of the month. He looked at the card. Or maybe he'd be able to keep the lights on after all. Ted nervously checked his phone to make sure he had the right address. He had come to a 2-story stucco building that looked more like a distribution center than a publishing house. Ted had worn his best interview clothes, a polo and a pair of slacks, and he already felt underdressed and unsure of the situation. The outer facade bore a simple sign, white and stark, just like the business card, Libris Talent. Ted thought about leaving, but the call of the money was too much to resist. The woman behind the counter wore a similar smile as he walked in. She was looking at the door as though expecting him, and her pantsuit and coiffed hair made her look assembled rather than styled. Ted was taken aback by her smiling regard, and he almost left again. The waiting area was as stark as the outer facade, and the receptionist's regard made him feel like he had been marked. Had she been staring at that door the whole time, just waiting for someone to come in? "Hi," Ted said. I'm looking for—" "Welcome, Mr. Dreff. Mr. Seraph is waiting for you in the back. Please go right ahead." She pointed to a door to the left of the waiting room, and Todd walked hesitantly toward it, his strange feeling growing with every step. Behind the door was a long hallway of offices, names neatly stenciled on the doors. Mr. Seraph's door was the third in line. Ted knocked, and a voice from the other side invited him in. Mr. Seraph sat behind his desk, the too wide smile stretching his lips painfully. "Mr. Dreff, I'm so glad you decided to accept my generous offer." Ted sat across from the grinning man, feeling like Faust as he met with the devil. "Well, it was too good an offer to pass up, I guess," Ted said. "Why, yes. The money is a fine incentive, isn't it?" Ted shuffled in his seat, not liking the man's regard. "So, how does this work exactly? Do I have to write something for you, or—" Ted blinked as a contract appeared on the desk. Mr. Seraph was leaning over the desk, too, that smiling face of his, a little too close for Ted's liking, and he handed him a heavy silver pen. Had that contract been there the whole time? Ted sat back a little, that too wide smile putting him off as the man leered at him. "What's wrong? I thought you were ready to sign." "I am. I'm just curious about what's involved in this," Ted asked. "Show us your talent, and we pay you for it. Couldn't be simpler." Ted looked at the contract, unsure of whether to sign or not. He'd heard of writers getting sucked into these unfair contracts before. He didn't fancy being someone's pet writer, his talent milked for God knew how long. Ted looked down at the contract, but it wasn't particularly helpful either. They offered to pay him for his talent, but that was all it said, really. It was very vague, not really saying anything other than that, with a lot of industry speak in between. As Ted hesitated, though, the money loomed up in his mind again. That was a lot of money, enough to live comfortably for quite a while if he was careful. No matter what they had him do, that kind of money could change his life. And even if it were repetitious or degrading, he'd still be doing what he loved, right? Ted signed the contract and pushed it back to the smiling man. Mr. Seraph made it disappear before the ink was even dry, and Ted was left holding the bulky silver pen in his numb fingers. "Excellent. Now come with me so we can assess your talent." Mr. Seraph rose from the desk and led him out of the office. Ted followed wordlessly, still not quite sure what to expect. The long corridor slid past as they walked, and the sameness was a little disorienting. Mr. Seraph stopped outside of another nondescript door and held it open. Inside was a stark white room, cluttered only by a desk and a pen in one of those ornate pen holders you often saw at weddings. Mr. Seraph nodded to the desk, indicating that Ted should sit. "What do you want me to do?" Ted asked, still hovering in the doorway. Ted wasn't sure he wanted to enter that unblemished space. "Just take up the pen. It'll know what to do from there," Mr. Seraph said, still grinning that troubling smile. Ted hesitated a moment longer before walking inside, the door slamming like a coffin lid behind him. Ted took a seat. On the desk was a single piece of paper, unblemished, and as he looked at it, he could swear that the surface moved. He didn't want to touch it, but it seemed to beckon him to nonetheless. He reached out for the pen, that instrument of creation, and it felt very right in his hand as he lifted it from the holder. He set the tip against the paper, and again he thought it moved. What was he meant to do here? What was he meant to write? Show them his talent? How was he meant to... The pen came down on the paper, its tip blotting the surface as though through magnetism. Suddenly, Ted was writing. He was writing words, crafting stories, spilling ideas as the paper drank them down before his eyes. He spilled days, weeks, years' worth of stories onto the paper as he wrote. His hand cramped, his wrist ached, but still the merciless pen took his words. The paper drank greedily, swelling as he worked. Ted's vision swam as he felt his words dragged out of him, sucked from his body, and he felt certain that he must die. The paper swelled as he wrote, becoming sheets, a novel, a towering juggernaut of pages. The room began to fill with pages, pressing against the ceiling and bulging against the walls. Ted was powerless to stop his hands from writing, but soon the pages began to block out the light, and he wrote in a state of darkness. The pages pressed at him from all sides, entombing him in written word, and yet he wrote. When he finally passed out, it was a blessing. Ted woke up in his bed, his arm throbbing, his fingers and hands feeling like rubber. But when he tried to move, he found that they were asleep. He shook at them, thinking that maybe it had just been a weird dream. He had written himself into a literal tomb, and as he looked at his arm, he almost thought he could see blisters on his fingers. He sat down at his computer, looking through his emails for job offers, when he came across a new email from Libris Talent. He thought it strange, considering that he had just been dreaming about them, and now they were sending him a message. He figured they wanted to make him another offer for his talent, whatever the hell that meant. He opened it and read through the email, confused as he read the contents. Dear Mr. Dreff, we would like to thank you for your talent. Please find enclosed the payment for your talent. We hope you are satisfied with the transaction. Regards, Mr. D. Seraph. Ted read the email repeatedly before opening the app on his phone linked to his bank account. Ted's eyes went wide when he saw the amount in the account. He goggled at it in disbelief. It hadn't been a dream after all. He had sold his talent, he guessed. Ted grinned as he thought of the possibilities. Mr. Seraph had been right. This amount of money could indeed be life-changing. Ted sighed as he stepped back to the door to his apartment. He'd been on a 2-week vacation in the Bahamas, spent those 2 weeks in the lap of luxury, too, and still hadn't made a dent in the amount of money Mr. Seraph had put in his bank account. It was a sobering feeling, being able to do whatever you wanted, living life that few ever dreamed of. Now he was back, though, and he supposed it was time to get back to work. The money was nice, but it wouldn't last forever. The news feed on his computer pinged to let him know that one of his favorite authors had just released a new book. Ted opened the link and looked at the book, but he felt a strange surge of confusion as he read over the synopsis. It was a new novel, not like anything the guy had ever wrote before. A world of high fantasy, a tale of adventure set in the world of Eridar, where the lords of the hunt sought the prince of... Ted was astonished. That was his story. He'd been fleshing out the concept for years, and his manuscript was almost ready for submission. He had been so close to sending it off. Well, maybe in a couple of years he would have. He had just been getting it ready before he sent it off. He wanted to make sure it was perfect. The manuscript. Ted had the manuscript saved on his Google Doc. Ted furiously opened the browser, putting in his information as he brought up the account. It would be time-stamped, dated. He could take it to the proper people and prove that his work had been stolen. He couldn't believe that something like this had happened to him. He had read about this sort of thing happening online, but he never dreamed that it would happen to him. It was unthinkable, impossible. His Google Doc was empty. The screen was devoid of content. He pulled open the drawer next to his desk, searching desperately for a thumb drive he kept there as a backup. The drawer was also empty. Ted searched the computer for traces of his manuscript, his stories, anything at all, but they had all been erased. Ted had begun to panic then. What had happened? Someone had been in his apartment. Someone had stolen his work. Someone had taken his talent. Ted combed through his emails, searching for the email from Mr. Seraph. It, too, was gone. Nowhere to be found. It was as though he had never actually spoken to anyone. He found Mr. Seraph after 3 weeks of stalking the coffee shop. He had gone down to the building that had been Libra's Talent, but it was abandoned. The doors were locked, the sign was removed, and the building looked empty and forlorn. It had been too big of an operation to simply close up overnight. He had asked the people in the building about it, but all of them had just shook their heads, saying they didn't know anything about a talent agency or a publishing house. That was when he had taken to stalking the coffee shop. The place was always packed, and if Mr. Seraph was looking for other writers to swindle, he might come back there. He'd brought his laptop the first few times, but had finally just stopped. He was too distracted to write these days, after finding out his life had been stolen, and all he thought about was having his work returned to him. He'd spent the last 3 weeks drinking coffee and keeping his eyes peeled. He arrived when the place opened, and he didn't leave until the final customer had shuffled out. It was just after sunset on Tuesday when he found him. "What we're looking for is your talent." Ted swung his head around sharply. The man at the adjoining table was talking to a blonde girl that Ted had seen hanging around lately. She was working on a screenplay, he thought. Working hard, it seemed, and it seemed that she had gained the interest of Libra's Talent. She looked over at the business card and told him she'd think about it before leaving in a hurry. The man sat for a moment, watching her leave, before turning to look at Ted. "Mr. Dreft, I hear you've been looking for me." Ted jumped, not sure what he would say, as Mr. Seraph came sauntering over to his table. He sat in the empty seat, his too wide smile making Ted cringe, as it always did. He took a sip of the cold coffee that Ted had left there and seemed to be waiting for him to speak. Ted still wasn't sure how to begin this encounter. In his head, Ted had always been indignant, downright angry, but now as he stared into that too wide smile, he felt unsure of what he was doing. "I assume that you're here to talk about your talent. I must say, when it hit the bestseller list, I was shocked. I suppose we could reassess your price if you're looking for more money." That lit the fire in Ted again. "I want to know exactly what the hell you think you're doing. You break into my apartment, you steal my work, clean out my hard drive, and then you think you can just bribe me with more—" "I did no such thing," Mr. Seraph said, rolling his eyes. "We paid you for your talent. Your talent was writing. You signed a contract and were compensated handsomely." "Wait, you mean you paid for my stories?" Mr. Seraph scoffed. "Stories? Mr. Dreft, have you tried to write since you woke up in your bed?" Ted thought about it. Had he written anything in the past 2 weeks? Had he even felt compelled to write anything? He had signed his name to a few things, maybe written a text or two, but other than that, he hadn't written so much as a sentence creatively. He'd been having so much fun that the need hadn't arisen, and that should have worried him. The writing was what Ted did. Without it, his life was empty. "That's right. You sold your talent rather cheaply, too, Mr. Dreft. But your kind usually does. You cut your goose open too quickly and find nothing as valuable as what you had." "So what is Libra's Talent, then? You sell ideas to other writers?" Mr. Seraph scoffed again. "Ideas? You're still thinking too small. Do you think that talent is something that just lasts forever? Talent is a finite resource, Mr. Dreft. It flows and ebbs. Some people are lucky enough to have a large tidal pool, but some people have to buy their talent to supplement. Libra's Talent finds those in need of talent, literary, athletic, political, what have you, and we get talent for them." Ted's blood ran cold. "So, I'll never write again?" Mr. Seraph looked a little sad. "Sorry, kiddo. Looks like you're just gonna have to live your life like one of these other talentless schlubs. But hey, if you ever decide you want to buy some talent, do keep us in touch." He left a business card on the table and made his way out. Ted sat there, hearing the click of the keyboard and the creation of raw ideas as they went on around him, and put his head in his hands. It's the little things sometimes. A good meal, a familiar song on the radio, a soft bed to sleep in after sleeping on benches or in sleeping bags for the past few years. The last one had been tainted for me after that night. I didn't think of myself as homeless. I had a beautiful house in Tampa, Florida, where my wife and my kids lived. I had access to the bay, a 2-car garage, a big backyard for the kids to play in. It also had my wife's new husband, the guy she married after our divorce, so I'm not exactly welcome there. After the papers were finalized, I literally walked from the courthouse to a camping store, and after $400 charged to the credit card I shared with my ex-wife, I felt I had everything I needed to start a more carefree life. I thought I'd just live rough from now on, and to hell with everything else. I would ride the rails, take day labor, and just be an explorer in the modern age. That's what I thought of myself as, an explorer instead of just a vagrant. After doing that for about 5 years, I've learned a few things, and lost a lot of the crap I bought on that long ago day. I've learned which towns will ask you to leave and which towns will throw you in jail for public vagrancy. I've learned which day labor companies are willing to work with guys who sleep in alleys. I've learned the best way to get a shower and a shave in a public restroom without attracting attention. It's gyms. Gyms are the best for that. But above all else, I've learned that sometimes it's best to treat yourself when you can manage. That's what I was doing. I was trying to treat myself and get out of the heat for the night. I grew up in South Florida, so the heat is no stranger to me. I remember sleeping with the windows up, ceiling fan on, hoping for a breeze to rustle the curtains as I stuck to my sheets. The heat doesn't bother me like it does a lot of people, but this year had just been so hot. The heat was near constant, and I had rolled my sleeping bag up for the season and slept on a threadbare blanket on the ground most nights. I was in a rural area close to Alabama, one farm community with a short name and a small population. I spent my days unloading or moving freight at the train depot, and my nights trying to find a nice place to bed down. Sometimes I'd do day labor, sometimes I'd do odd jobs for people, but the police left me be for the most part, and I thanked them by not getting drunk and making an ass of myself. I was considering making this a regular thing, staying for a few months and renting a trailer at the Happy Acres Trailer Court, but then I got the word from Doris that they were downsizing a bit, and they couldn't really afford to keep paying me under the table. Doris was a sweet 55-year-old grandmother who was just trying to make it to retirement, and she told me that she was very sorry, but they were just going to have to let me go. I didn't really mind, I suppose. I took it as a sign that it was time to move on to somewhere else. Time to do some exploring farther north, maybe. It was getting close to harvest time, and there were plenty of little towns in Alabama or Georgia where a man could get farm labor work and bed in the barn or a bunkhouse. It was hard work, but it was good work. And I was hopeful as I took the small collection of cash that Doris had collected for me and set out on the road. That whole day, though, was the hottest day I had ever experienced. I hit the road about 8 a.m., and I was walking up the side of the highway by 9. It was the last week of July, and you could see the heat as it baked off the asphalt. The sun was high, and by 10 I was sweating as I prayed for a semi to come blowing past. It was little relief when one finally did, though. The air that buffeted into my face was like a giant exhaling on me. I thought longingly about the big fan running on the docks and how I could catch a long breeze between unloading and loading trains as I drove my forklift underneath it. By afternoon, I was miserable. My back felt like it weighed about 500 pounds, and the straps dug into my sore shoulders. I was in Alabama. I had stopped at the rest stop to use the bathroom at the border, but I was a good piece from Dothan, the closest big city. If I could get there, I could get some day labor, find a farmer looking for laborers for the season. I could even just pick up a job at a depot or as a fry cook or something, so I could afford to stay indoors until it was time to move on again. As I walked that first day, I even dared to dream that I might find something less temporary and make Dothan a long stop. I had grown up on a farm, picking vegetables and milking cows and taking care of horses, and the idea that I might get along with some farmer and become his stableman or his labor foreman was appealing. On the other hand, I was a lapsed accountant, too. I had worked for an office in Tampa and could easily get back with a place and make that my life again. I could get an apartment, have a stable job again, maybe even see my kids sometime if they wanted. Like I said, big cities are sometimes full of possibilities, and there's little else to do on the road but daydream. When night fell, I was squarely in the Badlands. For those of you unfamiliar with Highway 98, there's a stretch before you get to Dothan where there isn't much of anything but fireworks stands and little houses. There are occasional gas stations. Hell, there's even a really nice casino out there that no one ever goes to. But if you're on foot and seeing it through the headlights of passing cars, it can be a little spooky. The remains of abandoned houses that are slowly being reclaimed by the land look a lot like haunted houses when the lights of a passing semi suddenly bring them to life. The broken windows of a failing business seem to leer at passers-by as a minivan screams away from them. The heat was still baking up through the soles of my boots, too, and I was starting to wobble a little when I finally decided to stop for the night. It was 8, some pink still on the horizon, but the heat of the 12-hour walk had exhausted me. I had intended to move over into the nearby scrublands and try to find some respite from the hot evening, but when the lighted sign appeared at the bottom of the hill, I thought it might be Providence throwing me a bone. Eddie's Discount Motel rotated garishly on a sign out front, and I could see a little neon sign beneath it that read Vacancies. I had about $200 in the compartment in my backpack, and about $60 in my left sock. Depending on how much of a discount Eddie's rooms were at, I might find a nice bed for the evening. As I walked to the bottom of the hill, I started daydreaming again, thinking about the continental breakfast, a hot shower, maybe some HBO before settling into a real bed for the night. I could check out around 10 and be on the road again, maybe even making Dothan before dark tomorrow. I barely noticed the hot tar under my feet, or the arid blasts that flapped my coat when the cars went by. I was on my way to something better, I thought. When the lobby door opened, I sighed in ecstasy as the cool air hit me in the face. The lobby was dingy, and calling it so might even be charitable. The furniture was of the bus station variety, and there was a magazine sitting on one discussing the first term of Barack Obama. My daydreams about continental breakfast drifted away, and I approached the plexiglass booth that housed Eddie, I assume, with trepidation. Eddie was a middle-aged man, his thinning hair pulled back into a ponytail as his Pantera t-shirt struggled to contain him. Even through the glass, I thought he looked distinctly greasy, and he looked up from whatever he was watching on his laptop with some misgivings. "I ain't got any spare change, pal, and I don't let people just crash in my lobby." I rolled my eyes, this sermon being pretty common amongst people who've never lived rough. Actually, I was wondering if I could rent a room for the night. Eddie looked me over and his glower softened. "It's 30 a night. Checkouts at 10 a.m. Cash up front. No refunds for stains or bugs." He tapped the slot at the bottom of the plexiglass, indicating that I could drop my cash in there. I bent down and fished 220s out of my sock. They were wet with sweat, but money was money in this economy. 30 was a lot to pay for a few hours of respite from the heat, but the thought of sweating out in the woods for the night had changed my mind. Eddie grimaced at the wet bills, but he slid them under the counter and flopped a 10 and a room key back at me. "Take room 5. Don't forget, checkouts at 10 a.m. And don't steal my towels." Then he turned back to his laptop and forgot I existed. The room was somewhere between swanky and skanky. There was a bed with a sagging mattress and some sheets that were only slightly stained. A bathroom with a shower and a sad stained toilet, and a TV that looked like it had seen most of the Reagan administration. All in all, it was a shithole, but it was better than sleeping in the woods. The only thing I cared about was sitting under the big window, and when it started pumping out cold air at subarctic temperatures, I was glad that I had shelled out for the room. The shower was amazing, but it was also the first indication I got that something was off. I left my clothes on the floor and climbed into the hot deluge. My skin felt like I'd stepped into a heat bank for a few seconds, but it passed as the hot lava coursed down my scalp. How long had it been? How long had it been since I'd had a real shower? How long had it been since I'd stood in a real shower, slept in a real bed, watched TV, had it all to myself? My eyes snapped open, though, when I heard the click of nails on the linoleum. The rings of the Dollar General curtain almost screamed as I yanked it hard to the side. My first thought had been rats. This place was slummy enough to have them, but I didn't see anything. The floor was stained, but my clothes were the only thing on it. I looked at the door, but it was closed. No rat could have squeezed under that thing. I pulled the curtain back, and it just started washing the day's sweat off of me when I heard it again. It was subtle, like claws on the lino, but when I looked at the curtain, I slammed hard against the cold plastic wall. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing and coming up short. It couldn't be what I was looking at, but I couldn't find any other way to explain it. The curtain was crawling with something big, something that looked like beetles. They were scuttling over the curtain, 4, 5, 7, 8, and as I slid into the ringed basin of the tub, I started hyperventilating a little. They were scuttling, their feet making the same clicking as they had on the bathroom floor. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them. They glared at me through the curtain as the steam clouded around them. As the water fell on my head, I gasped in pain as the shampoo I'd been working into my scalp ran into my eyes. I wiped at it, not wanting to lose track of the bugs, but as my vision cleared, I was looking at empty space and the gauzy film of the shower curtain. The bugs were gone, out of sight, but not out of mind. I searched the room, probably looking ridiculous in my old underoos, but I never found anything. Well, except for the stains on the mattress. They were a little hard to miss. I had gripped the mattress when I saw the old red stains on the side. If you've never seen old blood, then you may not realize what it looks like, but I'd seen my fair share on the farm. This was old blood, probably years old, and I made a mental note to sleep on top of the comforter that night. There were sheets on the bed, but you can only expect so much from fabric. I put my clothes back on and tried to make myself comfortable. It was hard. Those big bugs were still fresh in my mind, and as I lay on top of the sheet, I couldn't help but wonder where they had gotten off to. Were they waiting for me to turn off the light? Were they just sitting in the drain in the sink? As some movie played in the background, I found my eyes staring into the corners of the dingy room. The corners were dark, despite the lights being on, and I felt something lurking there. I fidgeted restlessly on the bed as something scrabbled over my leg. I couldn't find anything when I lifted it up, though. I was being paranoid. What did I care if the room had roaches or beetles or whatever? Hell, I often slept next to dumpsters or out in the woods. Just because these bugs had startled me didn't mean that they meant me harm, right? Despite my better judgment, I got under the covers and tried to get comfortable. The mattress was lumpy, but not too bad. There was a definite divot in the middle, though, a person-shaped indent worn from multiple bodies over multiple years. It seemed to be my only choice for sleeping locations. It wasn't a chasm or anything, but it had an uncomfortable dip on either side. I finally found myself giving up and lying in it, and as my eyes started to slip shut, I felt the bite. It wasn't hard, a little less than an ant bite, but it snapped me out of my semi-sleep and made me throw the covers back to look. I checked the bed, the sheets giving away nothing, and I couldn't find any ants or spiders or anything. I thought about bedbugs then, and I pulled my jeans back to look at my leg. It was nothing, a little red spot, but as I tried to settle in again, I felt another bite. It was followed by a third, a fourth, a fifth in seconds. I could feel something on my skin, little feet running up my legs, and the bites were painful. I rolled up my jeans and swatted at my legs, but there was nothing there. It was as though whatever had bitten me had just taken a chomp and left just as quick. I was back on the comforter in a flash, but the divot felt tainted. I sat to the left of it, shoulder against the wall as I put my back to the headboard, wishing I had just put up with the heat. I could just leave, I thought. This was America after all, and if I wanted to waste my money, then that was my business. The thought of going back out and sleeping in the woods, the heat falling over me like a blanket, was not at all appealing, though. I didn't like the thought of bugs crawling on me either, especially not bed bugs. Growing up, my parents had been fond of keeping dogs in the house, and I could remember spending nights with fleas crawling all over me as I sweated beneath my sheets. We had bed bugs a few times as well, and I remember the sleepless nights spent as they crawled and bit at me. It had led me to be very neat, something that persisted even into my homelessness, and it was almost funny that I hadn't felt truly dirty until coming inside somewhere for the night. It wasn't a big problem, though. Bugs didn't like cold, and I had the AC set on about 65. I could sleep on the comforter, avoid the worst of the bites, and still enjoy a nice cool evening indoors before returning to the heat tomorrow. When the power suddenly went out in my room, plunging me into darkness, I felt a small moan rise in my throat of its own will. I was left with nothing but my own breathing as I sat there on the saggy bed. The curtain window provided nothing but a ghostly inkling of a shadow light from the parking lot beyond. I crossed my arms around my chest as I began to shudder. The cold air hung around me like a cloud, but it would dissipate before long. Then, well, I might as well have just slept outside. The heat was oppressive, but at least the bugs were a little less forward. As I sat in the dark, I felt like I could hear the scuttling again. It was clicking, the noises scuttling across my brain. I looked around fretfully, trying to see where they were coming from. I wanted to run. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I just couldn't make my legs move. My eyes were roving in a panic when I saw the comforter begin to flutter. The divot made a little canyon in the bedclothes, and I could see something squirming up from that hole. They were big, looking like beetles from a kid's cartoon, and they came staggering up from the crater as they ruffled the comforter. They spread out as they searched for me, and I felt my horror growing as the waves began to flow my way. They were like a squad of army ants, making their uniform patrol as they looked for prey, and they were coming towards me. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got up and made a run for the door. I made a grab for my pack, but my fingers slipped off the rawhide loop at the top. I paused in the doorway, turning back to grab it, and that's when I saw them. The bugs on the shower curtain had been babies compared to these bloodsuckers. They were as large as dogs, their amber bodies clicking as they moved, and their piss-yellow eyes full of hate. They came lumbering after me, their proboscises quivering with anticipation. I slammed the door as I left the bag to them. I had a fleeting thought that I had left the room key on the nightstand, but that hardly mattered. I wouldn't have gone in there for $200,000, much less the $200 in change that was left in my travel sack. That's how I ended up running up the interstate towards Dothan with nothing but the clothes on my back and $10 on my sock. I must have looked pretty silly, but I didn't care. I was glad to be out of there, glad to be in the muggy air again, happy to have escaped with my life. And when the man in the Farmall truck came and picked me up a half an hour later, driving me the rest of the way to Dothan, I was glad to be able to feel the breeze that ruffled my hair. It felt better than Eddie's air conditioning ever could. Whenever I get the wanderlust again, I just think back to that night 3 years ago, and I count myself lucky to have gotten out with my life. It turned out that Dothan was some of the things I had been looking for, and others I hadn't even thought about. I found work. I found a place to stay that wasn't a park bench. And when the farm I got hired to pick pecans at was out of pecans for the season, the farmer was already having me work on his books to get him and his finances back in order. I moved into a little rental on the land, and I'm glad to say that my wandering days are over for now. I put this story here as a warning to those who still wonder, though. Eddie's prices may seem like a good deal, but watch out for the things you get on top of the bed and the TV. Those bed bugs have teeth, and you may end up as just another stain on the mattress if you aren't careful. I looked at the sign over the register and scoffed loudly. It hung above the bowl of fortune cookies like a silent guardian, and it had never made any sense to me. Customers are cautioned to take one fortune cookie. Taking more than one cookie may be hazardous to the customer's health and sanity. Management. I'd been coming to Yinshi Guzo for the last 10 years, and that sign had always sort of made me roll my eyes. The food this place made was well worth the 5-minute walk from my house, and I had never gotten sick here as I had at other Chinese restaurants. The food was great, the price was fair, and the customer service was second to none. Yinshi Guzo was a place I came to when I was depressed. It was the place I came to when I was celebrating, or when I just needed some comfort food at the end of a long day. It was my all-time favorite restaurant, and I couldn't think of anywhere I'd rather eat. I had actually met my wife here 5 years ago, in fact. Her date stood her up, and I was coming in for some takeout. We both sat in the waiting area, her hoping for a table, since the place was bustling, and me just waiting for my takeout, and struck up a conversation. By the time my food came, she had asked me to stay and eat with her, and I agreed. A year later, we were married, and we've been together ever since, and coming back to Yinshi Guzo as well. I was here again on a Friday night, date night for me and Lisa, waiting for our usual. Sesame chicken with pork fried rice for her, General Tso with white rice for me, and an egg roll each. It was crowded. Yinshi Guzo was always crowded. As I stood before the counter, the sign irked me as I saw it again, probably because the cookies here were my all-time favorite part of the meal. The owner is a world-class pastry chef, as well as a great cook. He makes the cakes for the shop, and his fried cheesecake is to die for. I think his fortune cookies, though, are the best I've ever had. I know that some of you are going to tell me that fortune cookies aren't an authentic Asian delicacy, but this guy has embraced them at Yinchi Guizhou. He makes them from scratch, putting the fortunes in himself, and they're so buttery and delicious that I could eat them by the ton. He refuses to sell them though, saying that they're only meant to be enjoyed one at a time, and I can't imagine how much money he loses making them like that. Wrapped delicately in their paper holders, they mocked me from the bowl as I stood looking. Leaning forward, I grabbed about 6 of them and popped them into my pocket. I couldn't tell you why I did it, not really, but it was something that I would come to regret. "Your order, sir," said the voice of Miss Kim as she came back. I jumped, looking guiltily as I smiled and thanked her for the food. As I turned to go, I heard her say something almost too low to hear. "Be careful with those. Remember the rules, sir." I turned back, but she had disappeared behind the curtain that separated the front from the back already. I shook it off. I must have misheard her, I thought to myself, as I took my food and left. I traversed the street, weaving between couples and clumps of people on their way downtown, as I made my way home. As I walked, I felt the cookies shuffling around in my pocket and decided to have one. I reached in and pulled out the hand-wrapped paper cover, looking at the little message scrawled on the outside. "Good fortune" had been written on it, and I opened the wrapper and picked the fortune out as I ate the delicious cookie in a single bite. It was still soft and warm, and the cookie tasted fresh from the oven. They always seemed to taste like that, and I assumed he made them fresh every day. I looked down at the little paper and thought for a moment that it might have been handwritten, too. Did the owner handwrite his fortunes or something? That level of detail really made these all the more special. I smiled as I read the fortune. Even if it was handwritten, it was still kind of generic for a fortune cookie. Tumultuous times are right around the corner. Aren't they always, I said to myself, putting my key into the lock as I stepped inside. 10 minutes later, I had the wine chilling in the sink, the food transferred to plates, and I'd found the perfect movie on Netflix for us to cuddle up and watch together. I had it all arranged and ready for her. As I switched over to regular TV, the movie primed and ready to play, I looked at my watch and tisked. It was already 8:30. She should have been here by now. She had been working late these past few days, and I was beginning to become worried. I reached into my pocket and pulled out another of the delicious little cookies. I stopped before unwrapping this one, reading the handwritten message on the outside before I opened it. 1 per visit. Don't forget the rules. I felt my brow furrow a little. That was weird. What an odd thing to write on the wrapping of a cookie. I shrugged and pulled it out of its wrapper, pulling the fortune out as I ate the cookie. This one was good, but not as good as they usually were. It was buttery, but a little dry. Tasted like a leftover from yesterday's batch. A sports center came on. I looked at the scrap of paper inside and blew air out in a little chuckle. A loved one is thinking of you. Another classic. My phone rang about that time, and I picked it up, looking at the picture displayed on the home screen. Lisa's smiling face decorated the screen, and I smiled to myself as I picked it up. "Hey, honey, you almost here? I got everything ready for date night." Her breathing on the other end was heavy, and it took her a minute to compose herself. "Babe, I need to tell you something. I need you to not interrupt me, okay?" That made me nervous. Lisa sounded panicked, and I didn't like the thought of her driving while she was in that state. I could hear the sound of her engine in the background, and it sounded like she was driving very fast. I looked at the clock and realized it was later than I thought. Traffic could be nuts this time of night, and I wish she would pull over. "Are you okay? You sound like you're... Just listen, and don't interrupt, okay?" "Okay," I said, hoping this would calm her down a little bit. I took out another one of the cookies as she prepared to speak and unwrapped it absent-mindedly, taking the fortune out with a deft hand. I'm pregnant," she said quickly, in a way that made me think she was expecting me to be upset. Quite the contrary. We had been trying to have a baby for years, but couldn't seem to make it stick. We thought we'd finally made it work a few months ago, but she had ended up miscarrying, and it had hit her really hard. She had really fallen into work, staying late and working on her off days, and these date nights had become our only real time to be together. The news that she was having a baby made me ecstatic. I was confused as to why she was so upset. The cookie was dry as I crunched on it. This one was definitely stale. "That's wonderful, dear," I said, through a mouthful of cookie. "I'm so happy you—" "It's not yours," she exclaimed, and the cookie turned to ash in my mouth. I felt it stick in my throat, a dry paste turning to cement, and I hacked it up and spat it on the carpet. It looked a little off as it sat in the congealing mass there, but my mind was not on the cookie. Not mine. How could that be? I've been having an affair for the last 3 months. When we lost Davin, I couldn't get over the depression. Someone at work had been flirting with me for a while, and one night oh God, babe, I don't know what to do. She was crying, and I could already hear it turning jagged and ugly. I wanted to be angry. I tried to be furious, but I couldn't in the face of her sobbing. Come home. We'll work this out, Lisa. We can... Huh? She huffed out, and I heard a loud pop of static before the line went dead. Hello? Hello? Lisa, are you there? Hello? But there was no one. I sat forward, bumping the table and sending the plates I had made spilling onto the ground. I heard the dry snap of the other 2 cookies as they crumbled in my pocket, but I hardly noticed. I tried calling her back, but it went straight to voicemail. I called again and again, becoming more frantic with each phone call until I finally bounced it off the carpet floor in a rage. What the hell was going on? What had happened to Lisa? I felt something papery against my palm, and when I looked up, I saw the fortune was plastered against it. I caught sight of the words, and it quelled my rage with cold fear. Your joy will quickly become ashes in your mouth. What the hell was that? That wasn't a normal fortune. Fortunes from cookies were almost always benign, or at least neutral. Did the owner write these himself? Who the hell would put a thing like that in a cookie? I stared at it for a few minutes before retrieving my phone and trying to call her back. The screen was cracked, but that hardly seemed to matter anymore. As my phone remained silent and hers remained unreachable, I was becoming scared. What if something had happened? The fortune continued to nag at me. So far, each of them had been accurate in their own way. What the heck was going on here? This was too elaborate for a prank, and if it was, it really wasn't amusing. I had started to clean up the food I had spilled when the phone finally began to ring. I grabbed it up and prayed that it would be her face I'd see on the screen. Instead, it was a blocked number. It looked odd through the star pattern of my broken glass, and I sat it down. I could once again feel the broken cookies poking at me from my pocket. I reached in and threw both of them on the table. One of them had come unwrapped, and the fortune stuck to my finger as my hand came free. My curious mind would not allow me to ignore it, though, but now I wished I had. You will receive 2 phone calls. Both will bring you only sorrow. I caught the still ringing phone on the 4th ring. Hello? Lisa? I asked hopefully. Hello. Are you the emergency contact for Miss Lisa Callahan? I am, I answered, unsure of what it wanted. This is Officer Winsman. I'm afraid there's been an accident. Is my wife okay? I asked, still a little hopeful. The officer was silent for a few seconds. I'm gonna need you to come down to St. Mark's and identify our remains. The phone slipped out of my hand again, and I could hear the officer saying hello from the carpet. The last cookie sat on the table, ominous in its white paper holder. The edges of the paper were black, whatever was inside having seeped into it. The covering bore a legend that made my breath hitch, and though I felt my hands reach to open it, I wanted nothing so much as to throw it out the window unread. The black letter on the front read, "Those who do not follow the rules are doomed to live with the consequences." My shaking fingers found the white paper just as the phone went silent. I've been lying on the floor of my apartment, smelling the aroma of old Chinese food for the last 3 hours. I don't know what to do. Someone came to knock on my door, but I ignored them. They said they were with the police, but I don't care. Lisa is lost to me, and I fear that may not be the end. I'm almost glad that it may not be the end. The world outside has quieted some as the night stretches on, and I continue to lay on the carpet in the fetal position, using what may be my last few hours to write this message. The black stuff that poured out of that wrapper, bits of moldy cookie floating amongst it, was nothing next to the message that oozed onto the surface. Your end will not be so quick as hers, it said. So if you read this, and you should see that sign telling you only to take 1 cookie, remember that the rules are there for a reason, and those who do not obey them may be forced to live with the consequences. Grandpa and I spent a few nights in the woods after the incident with the bottle tree. As good as I had felt the night before, my legs weren't quite up for the hike back just yet. So, we spent 2 nights in the woods while I recovered. It wasn't uncomfortable, not really. I grew up camping, but Grandpa liked to camp a little rough. I had thought to myself plenty of times when I was a kid that I was camping rough, scoffing at my parents and their pop-up camper as I slept in my sleeping bag in a pup tent. That was real camping, after all, I told myself. And as I listened to the wildlife make noises through the thin layer of fabric, I felt like a real outdoorsman. Now that I was lying out here on a bed of leaves with the cicadas in my ears and the bats catching mosquitoes overhead, I learned that I hadn't been prepared for what I thought was rough camping. Wednesday night found me sitting by the fire, keeping it fed as the darkness gathered into full night. Grandpa had gone to relieve himself in the woods, and the smell of our cooking fish as they crisped over the little wooden spit fire made my stomach growl in hunger. Grandpa swore I'd probably be able to make it back to the house by tomorrow morning, and my legs were starting to feel a lot better. I turned the fish as I sat and waited, hearing the fire crackle and the nightlife carry on their noisy chorus. When something else cracked, I turned my head to the left and froze like a deer in headlights. The woods around us were dark, but the gloom did nothing to hide the 2 large pair of lilac eyes that stared at me through the trees. I locked eyes with the creature, the 2 of us held in the gaze of the other. This wasn't out of any misplaced sense of courage or desire to cow this thing that was staring me down. I felt as enchanted by those eyes as I was scared by them, and my hands slid up to clutch the little ward that Grandpa had shown me how to make. I didn't know if it would do anything against the creature, but I knew that I would need everything I could get my hands on if it decided to attack. We had been staring at each other for a few minutes, my eyes beginning to water, when something crunched down on a bush not too far away from the campsite, and both of us looked at the source of the noise. Grandpa came stumping back into the camp then, and I looked back to the place where the eyes had been to see that they were gone. "Those fish are looking a little more burnt than I strictly like 'em, son," Grandpa said, sitting down and flipping them over. "Grandpa," I said in a half whisper, "I saw something over there." Grandpa turned his head, almost lazily, and smiled after only a precursory glance. "That so? Did you attract the attention of a boo-hag or something?" "Whatever it was, it had purple eyes," I said, poking at the fire as it started to burn down. Grandpa looked up from the fish like a robin smelling a cat. "Purple eyes? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. They were really light purple, too, like violets or lilacs or something." Just then, Grandpa turned back to the woods and cupped his hands over his mouth, loosing a call that sounded like an angry chipmunk. He listened, staring out into the darkness as he searched for something. He made the call again, but it sounded less sure the second time. I just watched it all unfold and sat in a state of extreme confusion. Was he calling to the thing with the purple eyes? Was he calling it to us? When something called back, the sound was a little higher than the one Grandpa had made. Something approached us through the bushes, the sound hitting my ears differently than the glumping Grandpa had made in his approach. I imagined it was something like what a fish heard when another fish cut through the water near it. It was whispery, almost ethereal, and it made my skin crawl a little. Then it spoke, and I felt like I might shudder right out of my body.
"Is that you, Fisher?"
"It is. Is that you, Glimmer?" When the creature stepped out of the woods, I thought for a moment that Grandpa had been playing a joke on me. Maybe this had been the cue for a friend of his to come out of the woods so they could have a good laugh at scaring me. The woman that came out looked normal enough. She wore leathers that might be a little too tight for the weather, and her silvery hair was pulled back into an intricate tail that spilled down her back. Her eyes were purple, the lightest of lilacs, and when she smiled, I could see rows of bright white teeth. It wasn't until she stepped closer that I saw those teeth were pointed, just like the ears that rose from the back behind her silvery hair.
"It's good to see you again, Fisher. You still look as handsome as the last time I saw you."
I looked over at Grandpa, who cleared his throat and drew the attention of the beautiful creature. "Over here, Glimmer." Glimmer turned her head and gasped as though startled.
"Fisher? What happened to you? You look shriveled as my great-gran."
"You charmer, you," Grandpa said, clearly trying not to let it get to him. "You look exactly the way you did the last time I saw you." She smirked, looking back at him.
"Well, it was only 50 years ago. It's not like it was very long."
55 to be exact, but Who's counting? Glimmer took a half step towards him, but came back for a second look and to slide a hand over my cheek.
You look so much like Fisher when he was young,
She went on, before sitting down on the ground next to Grandpa. She slid her alabaster hands over his wrinkled skin and laughed as the flesh moved under her touch. Grandpa didn't seem to mind, and she turned his head as she did the same to his cheeks. She laughed as she noticed his gray hair, and he smiled as he watched her admiring him.
What has happened to you, Fisher?
I got old, my dear. It happens to the best of us if we're lucky. This is my grandson, actually. She snorted, sounding like this was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard.
Your son, maybe, but there is no way this one could be your grandson.
Sad but true, Grandpa said. I sat and watched the two of them, her studying him and Grandpa accepting it with humor before asking the question. So, I thought about the best way to phrase this so as not to offend the sharp-toothed woman who had rolled up out of the woods all of a sudden. Who exactly is this? Glimmer pinched Grandpa's cheeks playfully.
You never told him about me, Fisher?
I did, as it happens, though he may not remember it, Grandpa said, giving me a little wink. I thought back, trying to remember all the stories that Grandpa had told me in the past year, and finally landing on the answer. Wait, is this the moon child you said you met in the woods? Grandpa cackled, but Glimmer made it sound like a seal who's got a fish stuck in its throat.
A moonchild? Are you still telling people that's what I am?
Well, most people can't pronounce what your people call each other. It's what I've called you since I was a kid, and you've never stopped me. Wait, I believe you told me that there was a story there for later. You didn't want to interrupt your story about the widow's candle, though. Good memory, kid. I suppose that now is as good a time as any to tell you, though. Glimmer let go of his face and reclined by the fire instead, the light making her skin look like pale milk.
I do so love the tale of our meeting, Fisher. I was such a wild little thing back then.
In that, Grandpa said with a wink, you haven't changed much, Glimmer. Grandpa made himself comfortable, preparing for another tale, as he looked into the fire that danced before him. Well, it all started with some fish I had pulled out of the river on that fateful camping trip. I had hiked off into the woods, as you know, to camp for the weekend. This was Friday afternoon, and I had arrived around mid-afternoon and started fishing. The stream was swollen from snowmelt, and the fish were in high spirits that season. I could have probably plucked them right out of the water with my hand, but I set about with my pole and my night crawlers, and soon I had a mess of fish hanging from a nearby tree. As dark approached, I had my fire built and my sleeping place laid out with a camp blanket. I had caught plenty of fish, 10 in all, and had decided to scatter the remains back into the river so I didn't attract a hungry bear or anything. These were fat river brim, too, and my mouth watered as the smell of them cooking assaulted my nostrils. I had turned to get something from my pack, and that's when I heard the rustling. I turned back, reaching for my knife, but there was really nothing to see. I had mistaken the fire popping for a rustling noise, and I bent down to turn the fish. I had all the fish on wooden spikes, and they were crisping nicely over the fire. I had a heel of hard bread and some cheese to go with it, and I was anticipating quite a dinner. Nothing works up an appetite like a good hike, after all. It wasn't until I had turned all the fish that I noticed I had been robbed. Instead of 10 fat brim, I only had 9. Someone had taken one of my fish, one of the end ones, and I glanced around to make sure it hadn't just fallen over. It wasn't in the dirt, and it wasn't in the fire, and I couldn't imagine that it had wriggled back to the stream all on its own. So I sat back down and picked up a stick I had meant to be whittling that evening. The fire ate the shavings happily as I fed it, but my eyes scanned mistrustfully around for whoever had taken my fish. Like I told you before, the woods were known to have tramps, and most of them weren't above a little sneak thievery if it meant not starving. I would have probably shared my fish with them if they'd asked, but Daddy had always had harsh opinions on thieves, and they were opinions that I shared. Even at 10, I was prepared to defend myself if I needed to, though I figured I would just run if they came after me in force. A few fish were worth less than my life, and wasn't so foolish as to go spoiling for a fight. When I heard the bushes to my left rattle, I turned and saw something take off quickly as it moved around like a caged cat. It wrestled bushes around the clearing in quick succession, its movements making me think it might be a coyote or even a big cat like the ones I'd heard about in town. As I sat by the fire, thinking about how it would feel to get jumped on by one of those big mountain cats, I remember how they said it had butchered Claire's sheep as they sat afield one night. It had ripped them open, eaten their soft parts and leaving their bodies all husked out. They later discovered that it was a wolf pack, but I wouldn't know that for a few more weeks. That night, I felt the fear creep up my spine as I felt stalked by this terrible phantom. Then, from a break in the bushes, I saw a pair of purple eyes. They studied me the way I studied animals I'd come upon on hikes sometimes. Animals caught by surprise a second before they bolted into the woods, never to be seen again. Those eyes looked at me just that way. They stared as if they didn't expect they would be allowed to observe me for very long. We stared at each other for a while, the fire crackling between us, and it wasn't until I heard the hiss of a fish sliding into the coals that I shook off the strange spell. When I looked back up, I expected the eyes would be gone, but they were still there. "Who's there?" I asked, blowing the soot off the fish as I took out my knife and began flaking back the scales. The eyes blinked, but they never answered. "Would you like to come and share some fish?" I asked, thinking maybe the eyes belonged to a person. They didn't seem so big as a cat would, and they looked curious rather than scary. They had probably smelled my fish and come to see what smelled so good, and now that they had decided I wasn't dangerous, they would want more. The eyes blinked again, and I could almost feel them weighing their options. Did they dare to come and see if I was actually dangerous? "I won't hurt you," I added, realizing that that's probably exactly what something that would hurt them would say. Their curiosity seemed to win out, however, because to my surprise, a wild little girl came crawling out on all fours. That was the first time I met Glimmer. Glimmer laughed, and it sounded like wind chimes under a waterfall.
He speaks as though we're not a grubby little creature sitting out in the woods cooking something I have never smelled before. I was curious and came to have a taste. And then he spoke. Imagine my surprise to discover that this thing could talk.
Had you ever seen a human before?" I asked. Glimmer shook her head.
I had heard them in the woods, but my kind do not usually go so close. We have lived in these woods since your kind hunted with bows and arrows. They rode horses instead of automacars?
"They're called cars now, Glimmer," Grandpa said kindly.
Yes, those. My parents tell me that we were once friends with the ones who came before you, kind. The ones who used the bows. They knew of us, but they warned us about the new people. They told us you all were violent, but I never felt fear about this one.
Grandpa smiled back, and I couldn't help smiling as well. How close had these two become? I couldn't help but think. Grandma must have been quite a woman to take Grandpa away from this one. "Anyway, I haven't even gotten to the best part yet," Grandpa said. Glimmer flapped her hands at him.
Continue then,
she said, scooting closer to my leg as she lay her hands against the log I was sitting on.
I have the perfect spot to listen from.
I felt my face heat up a little as Grandpa went on with his story. "She approached my fire boldly, sniffing the air like a silver-haired hunting cat as she hunched in the dancing light. She was like a coiled spring, ready to snap away from me at any sign of attack. She was equal parts distrust and curiosity, and I had never seen anything like her. My hands shook a little as I offered her the fish I had been scaling, but she shook her head and pointed at the one still in the fire.
I prefer them with the scales on. The scales taste good.
Her voice made me shiver. It was like listening to a river speak, like hearing a babbling brook talk, and I passed her one of the other fish instead. My hands shook as I extended it toward her, staying out of the fire, and when her hand touched mine, it felt like fresh baby skin. She snatched the fish away, sitting on her haunches as she ate. True to her word, she ate it scales and all, and her sharp little teeth slipped the bones away as she chewed them as well. She ate the whole fish, tail, head, eyes, and fins and all, and I saw her looking greedily at the remains of my own fish before I threw it to her. She caught it easily and began eating it too, as I grabbed a fresh fish. Before long, the fish were gone, and she was relaxed a little as she cleaned up the remains of my dinner.
This was a fine meal, Fisher,
she said, sucking the grease from her fingers as I went back to whittling. That's not my name, I said with a little chuckle. My name's... But she came very close as she watched my hands going about their absent-minded task. I had been whittling away without much thought as this little creature had stalked me, and when I looked down, I noticed I had a little cat. He wasn't completely done yet, but he was starting to take shape. His ears and feet were plain enough to see, at least.
What are you doing? Is it...
But whatever she had said, it sounded like bees buzzing in my brain, because I flinched and almost dropped the cat into the fire. She noticed my cringe and took a step back, her cautiousness resurfacing. It's called whittling, I said, showing her the cat. My dad showed me how. She came a little closer and watched in amazement as the cat was finagled more and more from the wood. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, the fire turning her into a china doll. Her skin was so pale, her hair like spun wire, and despite being a mess, it was still very pretty. She was dressed in what looked like a nightshirt, and it was covered in dirt and cockleburrs. I didn't care, though. I had never seen anything like her, and I made a mental note of her so I could ask Grandma about her when I got home. As the cat came free of the wood, she made an excited noise and grabbed for it, uncaring of my knife.
It's beautiful, Fisher. You are a man of many talents.
She sat by the fire, inspecting the little cat as a yawn coursed its way up my throat.
What was that?
She asked, trotting the little cat across the leaves as she made it stalk the sticks and twigs. Just a yawn. I guess I'm feeling a little tired, I said, sitting back and watching her at play.
Tired already? But the sun just went down.
I yawned again. I was just so damn tired, and when I blinked, she had walked her tiger across the grass. That's when I started to hear an angry voice bellowing, something like a startled bear, and she stiffened like a spooked cat.
I have to go. Daddy's looking for me.
She paused at the edge of the clearing, and when the moon hit her just right, her pale skin shone like diamonds.
I'd like to see you again,
she said suddenly, turning and looking at me as her skin shone like a lantern. I'd like to see you too, I said, realizing I was just as curious about her as she was about me. How do I find you? She thought about it and then smiled with her mouth of sharp little teeth.
Make this sound if you want to see me.
Then she made a sound like an angry chipmunk in a high wind, and the noise set my hair on end.
That's my name. Call me some night if you like.
I tried to tell her I would, but all that came out was a huge yawn and a muffled, "Good night, Glimmer." She smiled at me then, and as the fire went out, she disappeared into the woods. I wondered if I'd ever see her again, and thankfully, I did. Glimmer was smiling as he finished, her head against my leg as she remembered their first meeting.
Quite a few more times as I recall.
Rising to her feet and dusting herself off. Leaving so soon? Grandpa asked.
Sorry, Fisher. I've got to get back. but I was very glad to see you and your grandson. Call me again some night, though. I would very much like to see you again.
She paused and looked back at me as she added,
Both of you.
Then she was gone. Grandpa sighed. She's something else, isn't she? I nodded, a little lost for words. When I asked Grandma about her, she said that Glimmer was something hard to pronounce and older than the native people. She said that Glimmer sounded like she might be little more than a child, but her people could live for hundreds or even thousands of years. Grandma said she had befriended one or two in her lifetime, but their trust was exceedingly difficult to earn. She told me that if I had managed to earn the friendship of this moon child, then I should count myself very lucky. As we sat back and watched the fire crackle, I considered that I might be lucky too. Had Glimmer not told me that I might call on her as well? Could you teach me how to make that sound, Grandpa? I asked. And Grandpa smiled and said he'd be happy to. Maybe someday I'll tell you of the time I saw her before this, the time I told Glimmer it would be the last time we met. I laughed. Those must have been some extraordinary circumstances. Grandpa smiled as he watched the fire. Yes, well, your grandmother was quite an extraordinary woman. I've been working at the thrift store for about a week before I stumbled across the box. I say working, but it's more like volunteering. I'll save you the gory details, but needless to say that I screwed up after a night of drinking and ran into a bus stop with my car. Thankfully, it was 3 a.m., so there was no one in it, and the judge decided not to ruin my life over a mistake. He gave me community service and told me it better never happen again. Community service was ideal since I was in college and I ain't got a lot of money. I also couldn't afford to get kicked out of college for going to jail neither. So with 36 weeks of community service to serve, I sat around working at my local thrift store, Charlie's Second Chances. It's a pretty easy job. I work in the back with the other court appointees. We clean and sort incoming items so that they can be placed on the shelves and priced. Most of my coworkers are also court-appointed screw-ups who do the bare minimum and get their cards punched by the boss every week. Unlike me, they usually leave the job and go to a second job to pay the bills, while I go to classes or head off to bed. It's not difficult work, but it's a pain and it cuts into my everyday life. I'd been on the line for a few hours, sorting boxes and cleaning items, when I noticed a box in the corner that I didn't think I'd ever seen before. The carton looked ready to split, and it was so dusty that it almost looked like it was held together by the gray dust that coated it. I left the box I was working on and walked over to inspect it closer. It was wedged beside a bookcase in a wall, clearly having fallen from the top of the case at some point or another. I tried to lift it out, but the carton tore and outspilled what I first thought was an ancient Dick Tracy costume. Inside was a hat, a fedora, but not sharp enough to gain the interest of today's fedora wearers, and a long coat that looked well worn and well cared for. The front was covered in mud, and some kind of water or muck discolored the hem. There was a pair of black boots as well, also covered in powdery mud. The whole mess threw up a cloud of brown dust as it spilled out, and I coughed as I stood up, waving my hands around to clear some of the dust out. When it cleared, I noticed the book at my feet. If the coat was dirty, then the book was filthy. It was a battered old journal, a leather relic that was bloated and water-ruined. It must have once been a handsome thing, but now it looked like the act of opening it might be enough to destroy it forever. I slipped it in my pocket and brought the clothes back to the line to process them. The coat would never pass inspection. It was much too dirty, so I decided to offer the boss a few bucks for it and take it home. It was a nice coat, good in the rain and snow, I figured. I took the hat, too, when I saw it in the garbage on the way to my car. There was no sense breaking up the set after all, and I really did think it would make a good detective costume if I wanted. I didn't remember the book until I traded my jeans for some comfy pajamas. I intended to stay in and study that night. The pants clattered loudly on the floor, and I realized that the bloated wreck had been in the back pocket the whole time. I didn't sit a lot at work, and it had been virtually forgotten about once I stuffed it back there. I took it out now and looked at it. The cover was moldy, the mold now a little more than green powder, and when I opened it up, the same dust as the boots puffed out. The first page proclaimed it to be the personal journal of K. Barger, private detective. The pages were worn and some of them were stuck together, but I could decipher enough to realize I had found someone's memoir. There were notes that this K. Barger had been keeping to write his own story with, once he got out of the game, as he called it. It detailed case after case where K. Barger had caught this person or that person, helping the Atlanta PD solve many difficult cases with his partner, Dom Forthwit. Kay had clearly been hoping to turn this story into a book after he retired, living off the tales of his exploits long after they'd ended. My psychology notes lay forgotten as I pored over the journal. On a whim, I Googled K. Barger, private detective, but came up with very little. A few old newspaper clippings and a squib about his disappearance, and an ad for Barger and Witt Detective Agency that still operated in Old Town. K. Barger became Killian Barger, and it looked like this was his old journal. I also found a squib in the paper about his old partner paying for information about Killian, who had disappeared on a case near 30 years ago. I looked at the journal now with new eyes. This thing could be worth some cash, it seemed. It was more than money, though, by this point. The more I read about Killian, the more intrigued I became. This guy had stopped everything from hitmen to drug lords, and most of it seemed to be because he was at the right place at the right time and knew the right thing to do. His journal entries made him sound idealistic, if not a bit naive, and I wanted to know more about him. More importantly, I wanted to know what had happened to him. I flipped to the end, the last few pages looking harried and sloppy, and found the entry I was looking for. The pages were smudged, but I could still read his meticulous notes as he detailed the case he'd begun on September 8th, 1981.
September 8th, 1981. I knew it was only a matter of time before Chief Walker came to us. We had been monitoring the Lost Lamb case files with some interest for the past few weeks. 15 missing children, all of them from different walks of life, but the police didn't take much notice until Jessica Bradley went missing. She didn't fit the usual pattern. She was from an upper-class family and would be missed. All those before her had just been from poor families, low-income houses, or street families that lived on the fringes. Dom and I had been beating the pavement, talking to these families, but now that someone who mattered had gone missing, I guess it's time for the chief to take notice. He hired us as consultants. We would find the kidnapper and turn the information over to the police. We would not involve ourselves any further than that. The police would take care of this, and there would be no need for such headlines as PD Duo Thwart Kidnapping Ring. We were working for the police, and as such would be under their supervision. Dom and I gave each other a look, silently agreeing that that was never going to happen. We began immediately. The families we had already spoken to had given us a pretty good starting place. All the kids, including Jessica, had been connected by their time spent at Little Lamb's house, a children's home/daycare center where Jessica often volunteered. The police suspected that the home was a front for some sort of shady dealings, but they couldn't prove anything. It looks like a great place to start for Dom and me.
The next 2 pages were stuck together pretty badly. They had become wet and were nearly fused together. I tried to pry them apart carefully, but as they came free, I could see some of the ink on the paper had come free with them. The first page was almost ruined, the date showing up as September 10th of the same year, but I could make out a few words scattered through the damage. I gleaned that they had gone to the children's home, asking questions of a childminder that he usually called Minder, and been asked to leave. They had stalked out of the building, but had found out very little. Dom thought they ought to speak with some of the families that let the kids stay there, but Killian wanted to break into the Minder's office and see if he could find anything incriminating. I mulled over the information. The case seemed pretty cut and dry from here. Killian had the information he needed. He could simply pass it to the police and the case would be solved, right? The next few pages revealed how wrong I had been. Chief Walker needed more, it seemed. 5 nondescript white men in suits didn't give him a lot to go on. Dom struck out with his line of questioning. All the kids had been snatched from the home itself, and most of the parents were too distraught to be of much help. The next few pages were ruined. The waterlogged pages stuck together like flypaper, and parting them just seemed to muddy and ruin the message worse. They seemed to be covered in the same gunk on the bottom of the coat, dirty water or soapy mud or something. The Journal picked up on September 15th, and the news was more optimistic.
September 15th, 1981. I found a lead, the first one in days. The organization that supports Little Lamb's House has been a local installation for generations. The Malden family can trace its roots back to the founding of Atlanta. They've been giving money to local businesses since this town was a wagon track. I saw a picture of their latest patron, Dexter Malden, and he was a dead ringer for the man I saw yelling at the binder that night. I may have stumbled onto some kind of child trafficking ring or underage sex scandal. Whatever he wants those children for, it can't be good. Dom thinks we should be careful with this information, but I say the sooner we bring it to light, the better. He's as eager to stop this pervert as I am, but the Maldens are an ancient and distinguished family. We need to bring the police into this. Bring the arm of justice down on their heads, and prove that money doesn't buy your way out of everything.
The next few pages came away easily, and I'm glad they did. The writing was blocky and scratched. Killian seemed to be very angry at whatever exchange he had had with the chief of police. His pen had nearly poked through the paper several times.
September 17th, 1981. Removed. We've been removed from the case. We took our findings to Chief Walker, and he proceeded to get his ducks in a row to talk to Mr. Malden. We returned to the office, expecting justice would be served. They would find the kids, and that would be that. Even if they didn't find them, they would find evidence to prove that it was them, and the appropriate parties would be taken in custody. Case closed. What we hadn't planned on was that the spineless chief of police would call us and tell us to back off. He said that Maldron's alibi was airtight, and that we needed to leave this case alone. He removed us from the case, paid our outstanding fee, and told us he would call us if we needed any more help. If I'm honest, he sounded a little scared, too. Well, I won't be scared off this case. Maldron knows something, and I'll be damned if I let him turn me off the scent. I don't know what he's up to, but I mean to find out. Dom wants to put it all behind us. We've been paid, let's just go, he says. Well, to hell with that. I'm going to solve this case, even if it kills me.
The next few entries, what I could read of them, were mostly supplemental. Killian sniffed out the leads, Dom tried to dissuade him, and Killian continued to pound the pavement. It was becoming like a real mystery story to me. Killian, in his devil-may-care attitude, Dom, the brave but cautious sidekick, and Dexter Maldon as Killian's foil. The two played a game of cat and mouse that seemed to infuriate Killian to no end. Maldon was very careful about cleaning up after himself, and Killian began to worry that he was going to be noticed. Then one night, things went off the rails. Killian got himself attacked.
September 23rd, 1981. I was working on the Lost Lamb case, despite what the Chief and Dom want. This case is deeper than I ever imagined, and it gets twistier the deeper I go. You see, Little Lamb's House is not the first children's home that Maldron has had a stake in. Every 8 to 10 years, he suddenly becomes interested in the plight of children. Orphanages, children's homes, halfway houses, children's hospitals, you name it. 10 years ago, there was another string of disappearances at Pine Rise that are reminiscent of this very crime. I tracked down a janitor that used to work there, an old man now. He told me a fascinating story about his time at Pine Rise. He told me about the night when the sound of crying children had woken him. He had been staying on the ground. He was their 24-hour caretaker, and his room was on the top of the stairs and overlooked the gathering area right in front of the double doors. Pine Rise had a grand staircase. It had once been a plantation house, and the double doors opened onto a large entryway that was overlooked by a wide, sweeping balcony. He remembered rising from bed, thinking that some of the children were out of bed past curfew, and walking out onto that balcony to see men herding children out into the cold October air. They were still in their nightclothes, barefoot and frightened, but the men pushed them along without a second thought. One of the men looked up then, sensing the janitor's eyes on him. The janitor had recognized Dexter Maldron, the smiling man who had come just 2 days before to judge a sports day event for the little ones. He looked resplendent in his pinstriped suit, and he'd come up the stairs to put the man's cares to rest personally. He had heard I was looking for information on Maldron, God knows from where, and he had come to see me. He called me back tonight to tell me a very different story. He called me just before sunset and told me he needed my help. He said he was being followed. He said that something was tailing him, men or things or something, and he needed my protection. I asked him where he was, and he gave me the name of a bar about 20 minutes up the road. I pulled on my hat and headed out, the car grumbling pitifully about the cold as we drove. It was going to be a real howler this winter, you can already tell, but I don't think it'll get any colder than it did tonight for me. I can still feel that chill even now. When I pulled up to the bar, I saw the old duffer being walked into the alley by a broad fellow in a pork pie hat. He looked like a real outfit type, a hitter. I suddenly wondered if it was all about kids. Was the mob involved in this somehow? Maybe I was in too deep. I shoved my .38 in my coat, though, and went off after them. I'd worry about the details later. They were at the end of the alley, and I had just gotten my gun out and started to yell at them when I saw what they were doing. The big guy had his hands around the old guy's upper arms, hard enough to break bones, and the old guy was staring up at him like he was a serpent prepared to devour him. Then the thug's head and shoulders peeled back like a rotten banana, and what came out was so much worse than the porcine face that had been there. He was a living shadow, his skin like TV static and his eyes like fireplace coals. He opened his shifting mouth to reveal sewing needle teeth and a tongue like a boa constrictor. The teeth sank into the old man's face, and his scream was drank up by the hissing maw. It didn't eat him. Not really. The old man turned into that same static, his skin going the off-white of eggshell paint, and suddenly it was wafting into the creature as it slurped him up like a milkshake. The old man's clothes hit the ground when he finished with him, and my scream finally careened up my throat. It may have turned and looked at me, but I was already running by that point. I hopped in my car and was peeling up the road before my heart went below 160 miles an hour. I have never been afraid of anything. Not since I was old enough to know that people are the scariest thing out there. I've stepped into the ring with men who could easily crush me like a bug. I've gone up against men with more power than I can even dream of. I have never feared death. Death comes for all of us, whether we like it or not. God help me. I feared that thing.
The next few entries were Killian and Haddon. He was terrified that something was now following him, that the creature had seen him, and that any minute it would come driving through the door to have him. He was drunk more than he was sober, his notes often confusing, or his passages stained with alcohol as much as mud. He was a mess, his writing filled with fear and dismay. He was lost, his mooring having come undone, and it seemed that the case might have ended there, until he received the phone call.
October 1st, 1981. Final entry. I'm sitting in the parking lot of a campground in Panola State Park. The parking lot is full of expensive-looking cars. I hunkered down as I watched them lead kids into the woods about 2 minutes ago. I'm about to dog their heels once I get done laying out this last little refrain. The minder called me back today. He was crying, and if he's still alive tomorrow, I'll be astonished. He told me about how Malden had come to him, told him of his need, and told him how he could give him what he needed.
No, not even give them to him. He told me that I would stand aside and let them be taken. He told me I'd do these things, or he'd kill me.
Then he showed the man what he and his cronies truly were, and the minder had little choice but to step aside.
They ain't human, Mr. Barger. They're servants of something old and dark. He comes with the cold, they said, and he's ushered in by blood. The blood of the innocent will make him strong. The blood of the innocent will secure his power. They said I'd let them be taken, or I would be given to him as well.
And who is him? I asked, not really wanting the answer.
They didn't say his name. Wouldn't say his name. He's the one who comes from Strange. He's the one who ushers in the frost. He's the one who brings the change.
Why tell me this now? I asked.
Because tonight they will take the children to him. They will be gone after tonight, and maybe you can stop them, Mr. Barger. I certainly hope so.
He told me where they meant to go, and then he hung up. My .38 feels good in my hand right now. I'm preparing to make my way into the fire now and find out just what the hell is going on. If I don't come back, I hope whoever finds this knows what to do with it. If they do, tell Dom I'm sorry. If I don't make it out, tell him I hope he nails this son of a bitch.
And that was that, the last entry. I don't know what became of Killian Barger, but the news on the TV leads me to believe that it's happening again. They're calling them the Green Man killings, and if these kids were taken by the same group of wackos that are perpetuating these grisly killings, then I can guess what must have happened to Killian and those kids. I'm on my way to Atlanta with the Journal now. I've been getting some pretty weird texts from my boss for the last few hours, though. He wants to know what happened to the box in the back room. He's curious to know if I moved it. He's offering to waive the rest of my community service. Just pencil whip the sheet if I bring that coat back. That was a few hours ago. Now the messages are becoming a little darker. He's telling me that if I bring the coat back now, nothing bad will happen. He's asking me if I know what I've done to myself. He's asking if I want to die, or if I'm willing to be reasonable and bring that coat back. I don't think I will, though. The coat and the hat look pretty good on me as I look at myself in the rearview mirror. Besides, I want to look sharp when I deliver this journal personally. I want Dom to recognize what I'm bringing him when I take it home. I'm not sure which was weirder, the fact that Dad had a hole in his head, or the fact that he was just so unimpressed with it. Dad had come home from his job at the steel mill, just as he had 1,000 times. We heard him sit his hard hat down by the door as he stripped out of his jumpsuit before coming to dinner. Mom had meatloaf on the table with potatoes and peas, Dad's favorite, and we waited patiently for him to arrive like we always did. If this sounds weird to you, that's because it should. Dad had a strange idea that he should go to work, Mom should stay at home and keep the kids, and that everyone should look like an episode of Leave It to Beaver when he got home. I remember for a while, Mom met him at the door with a cold glass of beer when he came home. He eventually told her to stop so that the dust from the mill didn't get on her. It was odd, but Dad paid the bills, and that's how he liked it, so that's what we did. Mom had gotten half of her welcome home greeting out before it curdled in her throat. My brother had already seen it, but I was still looking at the TV around the corner and hadn't seen it yet. MTV was playing a song by a band I liked, and I looked up at Mom to ask if I could use the bathroom when I noticed Dad's head. Dad, meanwhile, had sat down at the table like nothing was amiss, opening his napkin and putting it on his lap. He was hungry from a day at work, and he had just started asking us about our own day when he noticed our horrified looks. What? What's the matter? All three of us were speechless for a moment. How did he not realize what had us all so gobsmacked? Surely he had to feel that. He had to realize what had happened to him. There was no way that a person could be so oblivious of something like that. In the center of Dad's forehead was a hole big enough to stick your pinky finger into. It wasn't like a wound. Wounds usually bleed or appear red or scabby. This one was simply a black hole in his forehead. The edges looked a little ragged, but that more reminded me of a hole that someone had drilled into the pavement than a wound. As strange as the hole was, the fact that it didn't seem to have an exit point was even stranger. Honey, Mom asked, trying to be diplomatic about the situation, did something happen at work today? No, Dad said, looking at her speculatively. Well, Stubbins was changing the no-slip grating on the walkways, but that's really not that weird, I guess. Are you sure nothing odd happened today? She asked, trying to tiptoe around the matter so she didn't upset him. Sometimes Dad could have a temper, and none of us wanted to see it. I guess, maybe, he seemed to think about it. There was this guy I bumped into on the sidewalk. I fell down, and he helped me up, but it was nothing. When she continued to look at him skeptically, he set his fork down angrily and glowered at her. Look, Martha, if you have something to ask, then just go ahead and ask it. I'm trying to eat here. Dad, there's a huge hole in your freaking head. I was never what you'd call subtle. Dad wrinkled his eyebrows at me. What in the hell are you talking about? There's a hole in your forehead. How do you not feel that? Are you trying to be funny? 'Cause you know I don't like jokes. Despite his gruff tone, though, he began feeling around his forehead, as if trying to find the source of discomfort. He seemed half-hearted, like he was just doing it as a favor, by looking at it in the first place. But when his fingers touched the ragged edges of the hole, he shuddered a little. I didn't think it had hurt him, not really. It was more like the shudder you get when you have an itch and you scratch it. He inspected it with his fingers for a moment before getting up to look at it in the bathroom mirror. The three of us hovered just outside the door as he looked at it in the mirror, and we must have looked like some old comedy routine as we waited for his prognosis. After a few minutes of poking and prodding at it, he finally turned away and walked past us, leaving us just standing there. We found him at the kitchen table, eating his dinner like any other night. "Sit down. Your mother's meatloaf is getting cold," he told us, once he noticed we were there. "Dad," I started, but Mom put a hand on my shoulder. "Harold, there's a hole in your head. Don't you think we should go to the hospital?" Dad turned his emotionless gaze on her, making it clear that he didn't want to talk about it. When we didn't move, he growled in his throat in a deep, phlegmy way. "Doctor won't be able to do anything but poke at it and charge me an arm and a leg. Not going to no doctor. Now sit down and eat." Then he went back to eating, ignoring us until we returned to the table and ate as well. We all tried not to notice the hole as we ate, but it was hard to ignore. As we sat and watched TV that night, the TV screen seemed to reflect off that dark hole. Mom laughed every time the audience did, but Dad never did. Well, that's not entirely true. Dad did this thing when he found something funny. 1 part chuckle and 9 parts phlegmy rumble. When I was a kid, I had asked Mom once why Dad never laughed or smiled, and she told me that he laughed often and smiled daily. It's just hard to tell with your father. He's not quite as obvious about it as the rest of us are. After that, I started paying more attention to Dad, and I'd come to the point where I could pick up on the subtle twitches at the corner of his mouth, the gravelly rumble when he chuckled, the minute crinkling at the edges of his beetle-black eyes. They helped me tell when my dad was in a good mood, and when he felt less like hitting and more like patting, when you could ask him for a favor, when it was best to leave him alone. It was a talent my younger brother never learned, and it was a mistake that often earned him a cuff upside the back of the head when he'd try to hit Dad up for money. Dad was enjoying the byplay tonight as Raymond bemoaned everything from his mother to his job, but my mind was still firmly fastened on the hole. As I watched it, I almost fancied that I could see it expand and retract as though it were breathing. I told myself it was the light from the TV, but the longer I watched, the surer I became that it was moving. It was like a ragged mouth, pulling in and pushing out air. It was subtle, like my father's moods, and the longer I watched, the more apparent it became. When my father turned his gaze on me, I realized he had caught me staring. "Either go to bed or stop staring at me. Creeping me out." I pushed off the love seat and went to my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything as long as that hole was on display. The next few days were uneventful, I guess, but I noticed that Dad started wearing a hat when he went outside. I wished he would wear it inside, too, because the hole seemed to always be watching me whenever I was around him. It wasn't, of course, because it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel that itchy feeling you sometimes get when someone's staring at you. It looked like it was getting bigger, too. But if it pained Dad, he didn't say anything about it. He mostly ignored it, his only exception to ignoring it being the hat he wore outside. Dad was stubborn, but he wasn't foolish. Dad was a sensible person who liked to keep attention off himself. Over the next 10 days, the hole got noticeably bigger. When we'd first seen it, it had been maybe big enough to put your pinky finger inside. Now I could have easily put several in there, and still he refused to go to the hospital. Mom tried to coax him, but he said it wasn't worth bothering a doctor over. If it was bad, it would hurt, and it doesn't. If it means to go away, it'll do it on its own. He went to work, came home, watched TV, and all the time that hole continued to grow. I found myself looking at my father more and more often, that gaping chasm seeming to look at me, even when his hat was on. I started having dreams about that hole, and in my dreams it oozed and bled, and a single eyeball rolled around to look at me. No matter what Dad was doing in the dream, that eye stared at me until I came awake, gasping. Then one day, he came to breakfast, and the hole had taken in his eyebrows. It wasn't a hole now, it was more like a pit, a crater that just so happened to sit in the middle of my father's head. Mom was left with an egg halfway to her mouth as she stared into that gaping void. We could all see it breathing now, the push and pull of its respiration as it drew in its terrible breath. Dad sat eating his own eggs and grits, pretending like nothing was wrong, but it was clear that he felt it too. He refused to answer any of us when we called his name, and left for work with his breakfast only half eaten. I noticed that when he came home from work that day, there was a different hard hat on the table in the entryway. The hard hat had a slant to it and would better cover the hole. Dad may act like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. I started avoiding him. I would come down to breakfast late since I knew he'd be at work. I would make excuses to stay out so I could miss dinner. I did any number of other things to avoid being in the house, but it hardly seemed to matter. I had begun to hear some kind of strange whispering as I lay in bed at night, and it permeated my dreams as the eye inside began to whisper words I didn't understand. The words were alien, harsh, and unwantable, but I knew their meaning. My sleep became as ragged as my father's moods, and if I hadn't been barely into my senior year of high school, I think I would have moved out. Then about a month and a half after the spot appeared, Dad didn't come down for breakfast. Mom told us that Dad wasn't feeling well. She said he must have gotten sick in the night, but the way her eyes looked told me something beyond sickness was at play. He didn't go to work that day, and unknown to us, he would never go back to work again. Mom moved into the guest bedroom, and I wouldn't find out till later it was because Dad had locked the door and wouldn't let her in. We could hear him in there bumping around. Mom would leave food in the hallway, but we never saw him take it. This went on until one morning when I forgot my notebook upstairs. I'd been heading to school, leafing through my bag, when I realized I'd forgotten my biology notebook. I had a test that day, and I wanted to study before class. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door to my parents' bedroom open. I stopped halfway up, not sure whether I should continue or not. None of us had seen Dad since he went into hiding, and my brother and I had been very curious about what was happening with the hole. I put my fingers on the carpet and scrambled slowly up the stairs, peeking over the edge of the stairs as I heard the scrape of silverware being bumped. I could see my father's back, clad in a bathrobe and knee socks, as he bent over for the day's breakfast tray that my mom had left for him. He seemed to be having trouble grabbing it, and his hands threatened to knock over the juice that she had set beside the bowl of oatmeal. Then he stood up, and I had to put my hand over my mouth as he came into view. The top of his head looked like nothing so much as one of those cartoon holes they used to trap each other. It was a swirling black vortex that looked a mile deep, and as he turned to go back into the room, I could see the hole was like some kind of optical illusion. It was exactly as deep on the other side as it was on the back. He turned and took the tray back into the bedroom, but when he bumped the tray on the corner of the door, I realized why we had heard him banging around so much the last few days. In my dream, the hole always had an eye, but in reality, it had stolen my father's sight. The dreams became different after that. Every night I dreamed that my family was eating around the breakfast table. My brother sat on my left, my mom sat on my right. Dad sat across from me, bent over his breakfast as usual. They all sat eating food from a massive pile, their breakfast more like a buffet. I seemed to be the only one paying attention to the strange creature wearing father's clothes, and the food he ate was pushed into the circle hole atop his head. As I watched, the eye emerged again, but it wasn't alone this time. The eye was in a face, and the face was long and terrible. The skin was tan and leathery, like a hide left out in the sun too long. The hair was white and fine like a corpse's. The teeth were jagged and yellow, its eyes the cataract threads of the chronically blind, and when its face rolled around to look at me, I would shake as its lips rose in an almost comical grin. As everyone ate, the mouth opened, and a low whisper began to assault my ears. Every night, that whisper became a little louder, and over time, I came to understand the words. Shally, shally, may ray, fori, fori, may gra, li, raleigh, grega, su, raleigh, drema. The words slid into my ears like slugs, coating my brain in the forbidden knowledge they possessed. I wasn't sure what the dream meant, but I knew that they were meant for me. Was this the thing that had been staring at me the whole time? Was this the reason I had felt watched? As the dreams continued, I began humming or reciting the words that spoke to myself during the day. I would catch myself making little rhymes out of it, and they were never far from my mind. It was almost soothing to speak those words, a balm to the terrible dreams and the terrible fear that wormed its way through my mind. I knew what it wanted me to do, and one night, I did my part. I needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, my bladder full to bursting. I was leaving the bathroom when I noticed that the door to my parents' room was open for the first time in a long time. There was a noise coming from inside, and it sounded pained. I thought maybe one of the dogs had gotten in there and gotten hurt, but I think even then, I knew what I would find. Dad was on the ground, his swirling head practically hyperventilating as it pulled in and out. The swirls had taken in Dad's shoulders and the top of his chest. He was lying on the floor, flopping around as his arms protruded from the vortex. I reached down and helped him sit with his back to the bed. He couldn't talk, probably couldn't even see, but he seemed to understand that I was there to help him. As I looked at the swirling mass, though, I felt the words come to my lips. I don't know if they were intentional, but I know they were the words that needed to be said. Shali Shali Rayma, Fori Fori Megra, Li Rali Grega, Su Rali Drema. As the words fell from me, I saw something swirling in the mass of shadows. I was worried it would be the huge eye, like the one I'd seen in my dreams, but I was even more afraid that it would be the ancient face that I often saw amidst the vortex. As it swirled and thrummed, I could see the white hair beginning to sprout from the depths. The head was coming on fast, and as those eyes emerged from the depths, I could see the corners cast up in a smile. My shaky legs took me away from him with small, stuttery steps. His face came free of the murk, but it wasn't done yet. As his head slid free, a withered form emerged beneath it. He was naked, looking like some kind of wizened mummy, as his leathery skin slid from the dark pool. Below the dark pit that had made up my father's head, his body began to shrivel up like a 4th of July firework, becoming blackened embers before my eyes. The more of that evil thing that came free, the less of him there was, and when his withered feet touched down on the soft carpet of my parents' bedroom, what remained of my father simply blew away. The old man reached down for the grubby bathrobe that Dad had been wearing, and tittered as he pulled it around himself.
Took you long enough, but I guess I can't be upset. You and your father have served me well, though you never realized you were doing it. Your reward is not sharing in his fate. Your punishment is knowing you are responsible for my return to this world. What you do with these gifts is up to you.
Then he left, just walked out of our house and into the night. As the sun comes up over my mother's kitchen, I realize I've been writing this since I managed to get back to my feet and walk shakily down the stairs. I've been trying to write down as much of this experience as possible, so I won't forget any of it. But it's so weird, and it's hard to put it all into words. What the hell was that thing that ultimately killed my father? Did it make the hole in his head? Why him? As I sit here watching the sun come up, I realize I may never know. I looked at the ad, unsure if my fever-addled brain was reading it right. Wanted. Someone to infect me with the COVID-19 virus. Must be verified as sick, have paperwork verifying illness no older than 2 days from today's date, and be willing to allow me to spend time near them. Will pay $500 for 8 hours in your company. Contraction of virus notwithstanding. Please email me immediately, with an email address attached. I had only been infected by the virus for the last 3 days, but I had been affected by it for the last 2 months. I had been laid off from work after a drop in profits had caused the store to go into bankruptcy. My boss had been very apologetic, but he still hadn't been able to keep the doors open. We had all hit the unemployment line after that, but unemployment wasn't as good as overtime. I'll admit, I had been living a little outside my means, and the bills were starting to pile up. Getting sick had ended my job search, and $500 was going to go a long way to settling my debt and keeping the lights on. And all that for letting a stranger hang out in my house for 8 hours sounded like a dream come true. I contacted him, and he offered to come over that very night, cash in hand. We discussed hours. I'm a dedicated night owl, and he agreed to come over at about 6 p.m. His knock dragged me out of my stupor at around 5:45, and I staggered up to get the door. I didn't expect to be greeted by a well-dressed man in his mid-30s. I'd expected a weirdo, maybe some disease fetishist who got off on being sick, but this guy was surprisingly well put together. He He wore black slacks, a button-down shirt, no mask, and his brown hair was close-cropped with a square pair of little gold glasses that made him look like a banker. He shook my hand, something no one had done in a while, and took an envelope of money out of his pocket. He showed me 5 crisp $100 bills, and then I led him into the living room. He sat in my armchair, leaning in close as I sagged back onto the couch and stared at me intently. "So, what do we do now?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just whatever you usually do. Watch TV, play video games, whatever. Hopefully my proximity will be all it takes to get the disease, and I'll achieve my goal." "I had wondered about that," I said, sneezing into a Kleenex and wincing as he leaned in closer. "This disease is supposed to be pretty bad. Why exactly do you want it?" "I'd tell you, but honestly it would sound crazy," he said with a chuckle. I shrugged. "It's not like we got anything else to do but watch Netflix for 8 hours. Tell me, it'll make the time pass." He glanced over at my bookshelf, eyes roaming as though he was looking for something particular, before settling on and taking a paperback from the middle. It was a newer book, Fields of the Foregone, and he nodded as he inspected the spine. He must have liked what he saw because he smiled and held the book out to me. "I see you're a fan of my work. I'll sign it for you if you want, but my books are part of the reason I'm here." I squinted at him. Are you Timothy Corvin? The guy who writes the Ghostgrass series?" He nodded. "Yep, 3-time New York Times bestseller." I gaped at him for a few seconds before asking my next question. "Why the hell are you at my apartment trying to get sick?" He smiled, but the smile was sad. "You could say that the writing is why I'm here." He sat down again and made himself comfortable before telling me the strangest story I'd ever heard. "I got sick about a month ago. It came on quickly, cough, fever, typical flu-like symptoms. But I assured my agent that it wouldn't be an issue. I'd finish my latest novel and have it on her desk by the end of the month. First couple of days weren't so bad. I was still lucid, and I managed to get some work done. I was trucking right along, making good progress, when the real sickness hit. Suddenly I was feverish, scatterbrained, and I could hardly focus long enough to get off the couch. I spent my days in a stupor, high on cold medicine and barely coherent. My nights consisted of rolling around in a fever-fueled daze that made me question whether I was dreaming or awake. I had these dreams, you see. I say dreams because I can't remember them, but I couldn't do anything but remember them then. I would sit on the couch and mumble about them all day, reeling through their world as I tried to wrap my head around them. I raised an eyebrow at him. "It sounds pretty bad. Sounds like you didn't get a lot done." "Oh, quite the contrary. The longer I raved about the stories, the more I started to write about them. Not so much writing, I guess. I read through my notes the other day, and it was more like drunken ramblings. At some point, I moved on to chronicling them. I would come to at my computer, banging away at a story, not sure what I was doing or how long I'd been doing it. The stories were great, but they were so far outside of what I normally did that I couldn't wrap my incoherent brain around them. As the fever started getting worse, I would slip into these fugue states and just write for hours on end. One day I came out of one and found I had an email from my agent. I had sent her a draft for one of the stories. I was so worried. These stories were really weird, completely batty, and I was afraid that she would drop me as a client if she read what my fever-swallowed brain had cooked up. He took a sip from his coffee then, wetting his pipes, and my own fever-addled brain became a little impatient. "So, what did she think?" "Oh, she loved it. She said it was the most unique thing she had ever read, the most unique thing she had read in ages, and wanted to know when I was going to be done with it. Reading through what I had sent her and the stuff I was working on before I got better, I can see what she was talking about. It is both similar to so many things and completely different. It's a timeless story that sits completely outside of the normal processes. It seems to contain 2 antagonists and no hero, a war with nothing but loss and stakes that don't seem to make any sense. It was almost Lovecraftian, and I found myself as interested in hearing how it turned out as she was. But that was where the problem arose." He looked at my glass of water longingly, and I slid it across the table to him. If he wanted to get sick, then more power to him. He was paying after all, so he might as well get his money's worth. He reached out and brought it to his lips, throat working as he swallowed. I tried not to gag. There was probably backwash in that. My meds were squashing the fever that was keeping my brain in its altered state of mind. I was always careful never to ride it for too long, but the high was more than a little intoxicating. I would time travel in those moments, starting on my couch and coming to at my computer as I finished more pages than I'd ever done. I throttled back on my meds a little, wanting to stretch this out for as long as I could, but eventually my body started to get better. My fugue states became fewer and fewer. I found that I couldn't tap into that hidden world, and the story wasn't something that I could just make up as I went along. It was unknown, unheard of, and my mind couldn't begin to tap into that place by itself. My agent was wild to have more, wanting an ending, wanting a sequel, and that's when I started thinking about contracting it again. I lifted an eyebrow at him. I know that's what brought you here, that's what you told me on the phone, but I still have a hard time believing that you want this crap. It's miserable. Between the headaches and the near constant fever, I seem to mostly exist in a state of misery. Some people are experiencing it even worse than I have. What if you get the kind that's really bad and you're hospitalized? It seems like that would put a damper on your writing. He shrugged. That's the thing. Even when I'm experiencing the same symptoms as you, I still get the urge to write. I don't know if it's subconscious or what, but my brain takes over and forces my body to keep writing. Maybe it's not even my conscious mind. Maybe it's this place, and I've been tapped when I'm in these fugue states. I've had this thing 3 times now, you know. If I had had water in my hand, I would have probably did a spit take. 3 times? My God, you rarely hear of anybody getting it more than twice. After I got better the first time, I was struggling to keep up, he said, suddenly looking far away. I tried faking it, but it just wasn't the same. My agent started to notice. She started to send my stuff back with notes like, I need more of the voice you had in the first draft. I started getting desperate. She told me that she shared my notes with some of her colleagues, and they were very excited about how it was all coming together. So I started putting the pieces together and decided that I needed to recreate the situation. You needed to get sick again, I said. He nodded. I needed to get sick again. I started slowly, waiting in hospitals and waiting rooms, looking for sick people, but I became desperate after a while. I got lucky the first time, a chance encounter with a sick friend. One trip to their apartment, and I was back where I started, feverish and coughing on my couch as I waited for the time skips to start. Did they? Would I still be running the ad if they hadn't? This time, though, something was different. This time I was treated to some of the most vivid dreams I've ever had. I wasn't just hearing about my 2 antagonists. I could see them. I watched them play their shadow games, maneuver their pieces, snatch territory only to lose it again. All the while I was chronicling them. It became a mania for me. I refused to take anything to dull the fever this time, but it didn't seem to matter. After a week, my fever was abating, and I was back to trying to fake it. But I couldn't fake it. I wouldn't even try. I needed the dreams. I needed the visions. I needed the writing fits that I never remembered. That was when I started running the ads. The lady at the paper didn't want to run them at first. She said I was sick, but once I offered to pay her triple the going rate, she caved. As I watched him talk about it, I reflected that he did look pretty sick. Not physically, but mentally, I mean. He looked like an addict describing his favorite drug. As he talked, he scratched at his arm, his face taking on a smiling rictus as he described the visions. I began to wonder just how this disease, or maybe it was the story that had affected him. I wanted to tell him to leave off for his own good, but I really did need the money. I've sunk nearly $5,000 into getting this disease. Did I tell you that? Every time I post the ad, someone responds. After so many, though, my body has built up antibodies to it, and every time I get it, it's a little less effective. The last time I contracted it, I barely had it for a week. I was so anxious to get any work out of it that I don't think I got more than 30 pages the whole week. 30 pages? I gasped. I was no writer, but that seemed like a prolific amount of work for a sick person. I know. What a disgrace. The first time I was nearly averaging 30 pages a day, but after the first time I never managed it again. You were getting that much a day? His eyes glazed a little. He didn't seem pleased with what he saw, and he looked at my popcorn ceiling. I see them constantly. I simply can't make sense of it on my own. I can't convey something like storms battling for supremacy, tectonic plates crashing against each other as they try to change the land. The fugues allow me to tap into something primal that could understand these ideas. My puny lizard brain just can't make anything out of it. You know, reading these things I've written, understanding only enough of what I've written, scares me a little. "How much of your book have you written?" I asked, not sure I wanted an answer. He scratched again, still uncomfortable, but wanting to discuss his drug of choice nonetheless. I've written 5 books. I've cataloged the lives of these two from the moment of their birth to the very last encounter they had directly. I gaped at him. He was talking about 5 books in what must have been a matter of months. I couldn't even consider something like that, and I began to wonder how large they were. The pages, the volume he was talking about per day surely meant that these were no small books. He didn't seem to understand where these stories were coming from either, which made them all the more mysterious and unknown. Can you tell me about them?" He gave me a dead-eyed look, and I almost regretted asking. It's not something people really want to know in the end. This little experiment started as a way to write the next great fantasy series, but my agent stopped returning my emails about 3 weeks ago. The last 2 endeavors have been solely so I could learn how it ends, how we end. We? Humanity. We are the ultimate prize that these 2 creatures fight over. More specifically, they fight over the right to subjugate and entertain themselves with us. We see their battles as normal. We see their battles as nothing but the changing of the seasons, but they see them as nothing short of war. I can tell you, but you won't want to know once I'm done. I didn't really want to know anymore, but I felt like I had to know. In the end, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. He spent the next 10 hours telling me about the battle between the Green Man and the Pale Lady. He told me of their beginnings in Strange, their emergence, and their eventual exile, and how they came to be on this plane of existence in the first place. He told me about the Brandylow, the servants of the Pale Lady, and the numerous agents of the Green Man. He told me how this green warrior was worshipped as a pagan deity, how he took his sacrifices, and how he sought out those who ran. It's funny how 10 hours can seem like a half hour when someone is telling you about the eldritch deities that you never knew you wanted to know about. When the alarm on my phone went off, reminding me to take my meds, I realized that it was 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. Timothy got up, checking his own phone, and seemed to realize that he'd been talking all night. "Seems I've gone over my time a little. Here, as promised," he said, taking out the money and handing it to me as he left. "Wait," I said, dropping the envelope and coming shakily from the couch. "How does it end?" He looked back and shrugged. "Hopefully I'll find out. If I do, I'll let you know." Then he left, and I wouldn't hear from him for another 3 months. Well, I'd never hear from him again, but he would make good on his promise. I felt better by the end of the week, my fever breaking and my headache getting better and better. I finally acquired a negative test and started looking for work again. I got lucky. The bar up the road was hiring, and they needed someone to start right away. They had only recently been allowed to reopen, and the bartender was working double duty as the barback to help out. Before I knew it, I was bussing tables and hauling kegs like an old pro. I enjoyed the work, though it wasn't something I'd ever done before, and it felt nice to get back to work after a long absence. Then, one afternoon, I was helping my boss open, flipping on the TV and preparing to tune in to one of the sports channels like I often did. That's when I saw the little squib on the news that made me stop. The city is mourning the death of local writer Timothy Corvin, who died of COVID-related symptoms in St. Graham's this morning. Mr. Corvin, the writer of the Ghostgrass series, is survived by his father and his older sister. Service will be held Tuesday for his friends and family at... I couldn't believe it. The guy had been in my house not even a month ago. Had I killed him? Had he contracted his fatal disease from me? I had to sit down. I didn't know what to make of it. My boss must have noticed that something was off because he tried to send me home, wondering if I still had some latent symptoms of being sick. I told him I was fine, though, and I went back to work. As I worked, I wondered if he'd discovered the end he was looking for. I got my answer in the mail a couple of months later. A package was waiting on the stoop. I hadn't ordered anything, and the return address was from Samantha Drummond. The delivery address was mine, though, so I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a manuscript, bound in twine with no title across the surface. On the top of the journal was a typed note from Mrs. Drummond informing me of her package's purpose. "Hello. My brother requested that I send this to you after he passed. He was very adamant that it be placed in your care. All the best, Mrs. Drummond." I lifted out the journal, opening the front page and bearing a message written in a shaky hand. "I found the end. Let's hope it helps you after I'm gone. I've been sitting here looking at the book for close to an hour, not sure whether I should read it or just burn it. If the beings Timothy had talked about had been using his infected body as a mouthpiece, I'm not sure I want to open my mind to them. This book contains their history, contains their past, present, and future, and this knowledge was gained at the cost of a life. Will they come to infect me if I subject myself to this arcane wisdom? That knowledge scares me more than a little as I put the journal back in the box and carry it to my room. I decided to put it in the closet for now. Some things are better left unknown, I think." Today started out pretty weird, and only got weirder. We've been out of the woods for about a week, my legs finally feeling less wobbly, and I was set to putting everything back to rights. Having been gone about 3 days, the dust had taken over again, and the house needed to be aired out. Grandpa had helped with the cleaning as much as he could, and now the house was back to its usual presentable state. When I woke up today, though, I noticed that the sun was high. Normally Grandpa wakes me up early for some sort of adventure, but no one had woken me up today. I went downstairs, expecting to see Grandpa waiting for me, but he was nowhere to be found. I checked the porch, the living room, his bedroom, but it wasn't until I checked the front porch that I found someone. It wasn't Grandpa, but it was someone. He was dressed in a long white coat, his round crown hat as dark as a raven's wing. He had his back to me as he stood looking out into the yard, and the back of his calfskin boots were silver and inlaid with the image of an hourglass in silver. It would have been hard to see if the sun wasn't so high, but I could hardly miss it as the hourglasses winked at me from the back of those boots. He hadn't taken notice of me yet, but I could have hardly missed him. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The man turned around, and I immediately wished he hadn't. To say that the man was gaunt would not have done him justice. The man looked like a scarecrow with a human skeleton hidden beneath the surface. He was a fantastic piece of Halloween decoration that had learned to walk and talk. He looked like nothing so much as some kind of other's idea of what a person should look like. He was wrong. He had no place in the light of day. "Hey there, youngster." I couldn't hide my shudder as he fixed his eyes on me, his words creeping across my skin like bugs. "I'm a friend of your granddad's. Is he home? I need to ask him something." "No," I said, the words just kind of spilling out before I could even think about them. I can't seem to find him. I can only assume that he's taken to the woods for whatever reason. Maybe you should go look for him there." He tipped his hat to me and walked casually off into the woods, his white coat visible in the field of green for quite some time. I stood and watched him go, and when I couldn't see him anymore, I made my way back inside. I couldn't even think about cleaning anymore, not after all that, and I set about making a cup of strong tea with some of Grandpa's whiskey mixed in for good measure. I opened the cabinet on the little island and jumped back as something pulled it shut again. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what had just happened. Was someone hiding in there? Why was someone hiding in the cabinet? I could think of only one person that could be hiding in there, and I was unsurprised to find someone holding the door shut when I tried to open it again. "What are you doing?" I started, but he hissed at me and told me to hush. "Don't give any sign I'm here. He'll know, and he'll find me." "You mean the guy outside?" I stage whispered, still pretending to make tea. "I told him to check the woods. He's not even—" "Doesn't matter," Grandpa said, cutting me off again. "Look, just go about your day and ignore me until dusk. Once the sun goes down, I'll tell you the whole story. But for now, just get out of here." I sighed, figuring this was just one more thing I'd have to take on faith, and moved off to try to run out the rest of the day. I couldn't help glancing out the window as I worked, and that's the only reason I saw him skulking around out there. At first it was just a glance. I saw that white coat and black hat standing behind a tree, or I'd catch that oblong face out of the corner of my eye and turn to see nothing. Other times it was harder to ignore. I'd see him walk into the side yard, but not come around the back. I'd see him walking around the front yard, but he'd be gone when I went to ask him what he was doing. As the day progressed and the afternoon grew long, his sightings became more and more frequent, and far less friendly. I would often get glimpses of him behind me or to the left of me as I worked in the house. I could feel eyes on me, but I'd turn around to find nothing there. I could feel his hateful gaze on me right up until the sun set and the crickets began to tune up. Then he vanished as suddenly as he'd arrived. I was sitting out on the back porch, a beer sweating in my cup holder, when Grandpa came slowly from the house. He wasn't in his usual put-together state. His hair was mussed, his clothes were dirty, and he kept rubbing his backside as he sat stiffly in his usual porch chair. I handed him a cold beer, and he took a long pull off it before saying anything. "Thanks, son. It's been a long day," he said as he settled into his chair. "So," I asked after a few minutes of tactful silence, "want to tell me why you were hiding in your secret compartment in the kitchen?" "Sure you want to know? Once you know, it's not the sort of thing you can just unknow," he said, tipping me a little wink. I thought it over for a minute and finally nodded, deciding that I already knew enough terrible stuff, and one more thing probably wouldn't hurt me too badly. On that score, I guess I was wrong. "Once a year, I receive a visit from the Weldergeist, so he can collect his debt, and every year I manage to avoid paying him." "So you're welching on a debt now? That doesn't seem like you." Grandpa chuckled. "Well, to be fair, the Weldergeist is a tricky creature that only appears when he knows you need his help, and he charges a pretty steep fee. He came to me in, well, a moment of weakness, when he knew I would accept his offer, and made me a deal I couldn't refuse. It was a sucker's bet, though, and he knew it. I just had because I have no intention of paying for something that he never really delivered on." "What was that exactly?" I asked, trying to be casual, but very curious. Grandpa opened his mouth, but instead just looked off into the woods. That's a story for another day, or maybe never." "Fair enough," I said, taking another pull off my bottle. "Well, why not just pay him and be done with it?" "'Cause I promised him the remaining years of my life," Grandpa said. He said it as offhandedly as you might tell someone you lost a watch in a card game. I spit beer across the porch. "Why in God's name would you do such a thing?" Grandpa just shrugged. "It's not that uncommon for people in the know to make deals with the Weldergeist. The Weldergeist will grant people power, but there's always a price. If you're careful and a little bit clever, you can trick him and pay nothing for his gift." "Is that why you're hiding?" I asked. He nodded. "Once a year, the Weldergeist sends you a missive. It tells you that he will come and that your business must be conducted before the sun sets on that day. That means you're safe for a whole year if you can avoid him on that particular day. You were visiting some friends for the weekend when it happened last year, so you probably don't remember me spending the whole day in my hiding spot." I nodded, taking his words in and rolling them around. I guess it made sense. I knew that Grandpa knew of these strange creatures, but after meeting Glimmer last week, I was coming to understand that he also had a unique relationship with many of them. Grandpa wasn't just some Van Helsing type who fought the monsters. He realized that living in the Appalachians meant living with them and adapting to them. "Still," I said, rolling the bottle of beer in between my fingers and warming it, "seems an odd way to live sometimes." Grandpa chuckled. "I can imagine that it would be. It was strange for me when I was young, too. Grandma kinda introduced me to this strange and sometimes frightening world, and then disappeared just as I was getting used to it." "Wait," I said, I thought you said your grandmother died." "For all intents and purposes, she did. I suppose it's time I told you about that, since it ties in very closely with the Weldergeist. feel like a story, kiddo?" he asked, tossing the bottle and reaching for another. I told him I did, and he popped the top as he looked off into the woods. "This happened when I was about 15. I would look back on it as one of the saddest days of my life." I was coming home from school when I remembered that Grandma had wanted me to come over for lessons that day. I sighed, not really wanting to spend my afternoon in Grandma's kitchen as we pored over dusty old books. I was at that age where I guess I didn't really believe in magic like I used to, and this was all starting to feel a little superstitious. That probably sounds weird, given what I've told you I'd seen, but it's easy to forget the bad times when you're living through the good ones. I still learned the woodsy ways, and I still went with Grandma sometimes when she did her rounds, but I was older now and thinking strongly about using my afternoons for work or for spending time with my friends. But I was a good boy, and I didn't want to let my Grandma down, so I went to her house for my lessons. Despite my doubts, we had a busy time over the last few years. Grandma and I had cleansed a few houses, blessed a few plots of land, and had a nasty encounter with a boo-hag one night in Reverend Tucker's house. I don't think the good Reverend had believed in such things before then, but when Grandma pulled the boo-hag off of him as it attempted to drain his life force, he couldn't very well doubt it. He and Grandma had come to a shaky sort of friendship, despite Grandma keeping her own sort of ways. "Why depend on the good Lord for everything when you can do for yourself?" Grandma often said. "Poor fella has enough on his plate without having to worry about me." I saw Grandma's house as I came up the road, but it was the man that caught my eye first. I say man, but, well, you've seen him. He's no man, that's certain. He was dressed in a long white peacoat, his head crowned with a dark hat like a cattleman. He wore these boots, but I saw silver on the back before I saw the soft calfskin of them. They had hourglasses on them, and the sand almost seemed to run through 'em as the sun caught 'em. He turned as I approached, and I stopped when his presence fell on me. He was just wrong. His body was like someone wearing another person's skin. His face bulged in places that a normal face shouldn't. His whole posture and geometry made my eyes water a little, and I couldn't understand how he could exist at all. He smiled when he saw me, and the look made me think of a wild animal that had gotten a pair of dentures from the garbage. "Hey there, youngster. I'm looking for your grandmother. She's an old friend of mine, and we're supposed to meet to discuss some things. You wouldn't know where she is, would you?" I couldn't find the words right away, so I just shook my head. "That's a shame," he said, sounding bored rather than mournful. "Well, if you should find her." Then he turned away and looked around like she might be standing just behind a tree or something. I don't, but he turned, and I had to force the words past my teeth. "I don't remember ever seeing you before. How do you know my grandmother?" He turned back towards me, and I suddenly wished I'd just let him leave. He came closer this time, bending down so he could come to eye level with me. He was pretty tall, or I was short for 15 maybe, and when he bent, I heard a sound like a tree limb groaning in a high wind. It was an unhealthy sound, the kind that bones make just before they break. "That is an interesting question," he said, his breath smelling like something rotten. "I suppose your grandma and I met when she was about your age. She needed something, and I had it, so we made a deal. Your grandma's tried to escape that deal for a very long time, but I'm sure I'll collect what I'm owed one of these days." He was very close to my face, and I felt like a rabbit trapped in the sight of a predator. I was not a small teenager, 5'5", and
muscled from working in the woods and helping my daddy, but this man made me feel like a toddler. Even bent at the knee, I felt like he could unhinge his jaw and simply swallow me up. As he smiled at me, I felt sure I could see something moving beneath his skin. Not bones, but something like bugs or hell, I don't know. I was young and full of myself, but this wasn't the first time I had been face to face with something I could neither fight nor understand. Suddenly I was a young boy who was watching a monstrous cat as it peeked at him through my front door, and I didn't like it. Maybe you'd like to make a deal. Is there something you desire, youngster? Maybe a woman you fancy who won't give you the time of day? Maybe you'll require wealth, prestige, power. He said the last like it was something both sexual and dark. The word felt like the thing I sometimes thought about late at night as I lay in bed. It felt like the decadent cake my mom made sometimes. I suddenly wanted to roll in it as this terrible stranger watched. Suddenly, the man didn't seem so terrible to me. I could see myself with Kathy Marty on my arm, the prettiest girl in the valley, with a pocket full of money and a brand new Ford to parade around town in. More than that, I could see myself living without the fear I had held for spirits and woodland devils and all the other things that went bump in the night. Behind that power, I could see this creature hunkered, and the idea was no longer so terrible. I can make all that happen. I can bring it all to you, make it yours, but only after we make a little deal. He had extended a hand to me, and I had reached shakily out to take it. That was when my grandmother's voice cut across my foggy mind like a cleaver through a calf's brain. "Get away from him," she growled, and I could see that she was standing on the front porch. Had she always been there? Had both of us just completely missed her? She was dressed in a long black dress, a sundress of some kind, and even at her age she stood tall and proud. She stared at the thing that I had no name for at the time, and seemed to dare it to lay a finger on me. "Why, Elizabeth Gretchen Chambry, if it isn't my old friend. I'm so glad that you have agreed to come and conclude our business. Let's go inside, then, and see it put to rest." "Very well," she said, stepping off the porch and in between us. "I would like a word with my grandson first, however." "Of course," he said, walking onto the porch, but keeping a careful eye on Grandma as he went. "Do hurry, though. Places to be, people to see." Grandma wrapped me in a hug, her smell enveloping me as she whispered into my ear. Her voice was the most frantic I had ever heard it, and she seemed to be trying to tell me as much as possible in as low a tone as possible. It was clear she didn't want the man to hear us, and I couldn't blame her one bit. All the haze had fled from me, and I was aware again of his dubious geometry. Run home right away, and don't look back. If that man comes to you again, don't let him trap you like he's trapped me. I love you, boy. Keep your studies and make me proud. Now go and don't look back." I ran then, showing my heels up the road and not stopping until I was back inside my house. I was crying on the front porch when my mother found me, and I wouldn't tell her why. A powerful assuredness had come over me, and I knew what I would next find when I went to my grandmother's house. A night bird sounded off in the woods somewhere, and the return call sounded spooky amidst the sound of crickets. Grandpa launched another bottle into the woods, and I heard it shatter as it hit the tree somewhere out there. I expected he would reach for another, but he just sat there and stared out into the woods. She was hiding from him for years,
but it was my fault that he caught her. She could have lived for years and years, but I had to go and get involved. As far as I was concerned, I had killed her. I found her sitting at the table the next day. She was just sitting there, looking so peaceful, her eyes staring and glassy. They wanted to bury her, but her will was very clear. I put her ashes in the valley next to Renoir's tree. That was the summer I started drinking, about a year and a half before the lights killed my friends. The two of us sat there in silence, listening to the forest hum. If you knew what he was, why did you make the deal? Grandpa didn't seem to want to answer, and I had decided that he wasn't going to, when finally he whispered, You wouldn't understand until you've lost someone, like I've lost someone. You can't know what you would trade for them back. He got up then, saying he was tired and heading off to bed. I sat on the porch and mulled that one over for quite some time. They tell you when you start to prepare yourself to work for 12 hours. Most of us had come from jobs where we worked 8-hour days, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I had been an office drone when I found this job in the paper, and it had been an easy choice to switch to a job that would nearly double my take-home pay. I had accrued my share of debt in college, and my student loans were high enough to keep me under the company's thumb until I retired. With the level of pay I was receiving from the prison, however, I could afford to be out of debt in a decade instead of 30 years. Stragview Prison seemed like an escape in those days. In onboarding, they caution you about many things. The inmates, the stress, the workload, and the long hours are always the main bullet points in any presentation. They tell you that you will likely work the night shift for the first 2 years of employment. As a male, they told me that I would probably have to work in the close management dorm, the cell blocks with the rolling doors and the bars on the windows. They told me I would be placed in confinement as a permanent floor officer, where I would have insults and excrement flung at me in equal amounts. They warned us, the fresh-faced TAs who had yet to set foot on the holy ground that was the compound, that we would see things here that we wouldn't see anywhere else. We would be assaulted with ideas and actions that had no place in the outside world. They told us that normal people would look at us and scratch their heads when we tried to tell them that the things they saw on TV weren't the way things actually were. They told us to prepare to be unable to relate to the people who had once been our friends and draw close to the new friends we made while we were on the compound. Above all, they warned us about the strain of our newfound careers. They warned us about the mental stress of day sleeping, sleep deprivation, the long nights that never end. They told us that we would feel the urge to sleep, that we might even find our focus slipping, but that we had to be diligent. We had to be watchful. They told us that we could never take our eyes off them, even for a second, or they would bite like a bad dog. They had selected 2 instructors from the compound for us to learn from. One was a plucky sergeant who worked the religious dorm. I think her name was Dotson. She talked a lot about reform and about inmates turning over new leaves and how it was up to us to provide positive influence, so they knew that there was something outside those walls. The other was a grizzled old warhorse who looked as though he had been carved from the abandoned rock quarry that sat at the edge of the compound. He was tall and gray and seemed uncomfortable in the daylight. He was the one who would tell us, with wide eyes possessed of that 1,000-yard stare, that we must be vigilant and that we must be prepared. He told us about the shifts that last for days. He talked about the shifts that last your whole life. I didn't understand what he meant until that day, until I found my own never-ending 12-hour shift. What happened was a freak accident, which means it had been meticulously planned for weeks. The H-dorm inmates had likely been planning the event, but what happened before it was a perfect shitstorm. We had been experiencing a very aggressive sickness that had put most of the dorms in quarantine. The dorms that were not infected were being used to cook the meals, do the laundry, and go about the other day-to-day activities that needed volunteers. These men, of course, had never been trained to do a lot of these things, so as the food quality decreased and the number of inmates on quarantine increased, an underlying panic seemed to permeate the compound. I'm writing this down so someone will remember it later. I'm writing it down so I might remember it later. If there is a later, I guess. Hour 1. When we were called to Quad 4 of H-Dorm, it was to break up a fight. H-Dorm was not under quarantine, but the dorm was a melting pot of different gangs, and they were all afraid of the sick people. The fight was already done by the time we arrived, the parties involved having melted into the crowd. We were left to find them, make sure they received the medical attention they needed, and were adequately punished for disrupting the normal flow of the compound. I was accompanied by 2 other officers, each more useless than the last. Officer Fest was a captain's pet, a bootlicking ladder climber who was better at taking naps than being an officer. He was joined by Sergeant Creast, a year-and-a-day man who was more experienced at smoking cigarettes outside the captain's office than running a dorm. When I had been called for assistance, the captain had found them hanging out by his door and directed them to help me. Together, they might have been a complete officer, but just barely. I didn't much care. This was my dorm, and I was going to have control. The other officers were purely for appearance. I had a reputation for being fair but firm with my dorm, and that level of consistency goes a long way with these guys. I would have walked out onto the floor by myself any other day and gained immediate control of the situation with a few words and command presence. This was a situation that called for more presence than just me, though. So, the 3 of us left the officer station and went out to put them in their cells and assess the damage. When we arrived, it was clear that the fight was not as over as I had thought. The large group was gathered around a single man. His nose was bloody, and he seemed to be backing himself up against the door of the quad. When we came in, he nearly leapt out into the sally port to get away from the mob. Creast pulled him out, slapping some cuffs on him, and took him away before he could do more than sputter. Fest moved in behind me, popping the seal on his gas as he came to the door. I put out a hand, trying to waylay him, but it was already too late. As the group came towards us, I could see the knives coming out, and knew that words were not going to cut it with this bunch. The mob was howling about the man being a carrier, someone with the sickness, and wanted him dead. I reached for my gas, but I was a little too late. The knife slipped into my guts, and I was overcome with the most intense pain of my life. I grabbed my stomach and stumbled back, the mob spilling out the door behind me. They had no real interest in me. They wanted the man that had started the problem. As I leaned up against the glass, I could hear the sirens going off as Hazard, the officer I'd left in the station, saw the carnage and hit the lockdown alarm. My radio exploded with sound, the clarion call of 1024, officer down in Quad 4 of H-Dorm. I saw the mob as it rolled over poor Fest, the orange spray flying indiscriminately as their knives twinkled in slashing arcs. They would soon hit the door and realize that they were locked in, which would make them very angry. That's when they would finally notice poor wounded me and come looking for keys. In the chaos, I scooted on my butt across the slippery floor. I tried to stand, but my knees were kind of shaky, so I made for an empty cell near the mop closet. I shuffled, my guts a mess of angry snakes, as the men at the back of the mob began to divert and come after me. I dug at my gas with my free hand, sending out an orange stream at the ones who had wandered too close. They stepped back, hissing their displeasure as they gripped their faces and rubbed their eyes, and I stumbled into the cell and slammed the door in their face before they could recover. The slamming door was like a coffin lid slamming shut. This cell would be my shelter for the next 12 hours. This cell would be my hell for the next 12 hours. Hour 2. The sun started to set. I could see it through the grates and the plexiglass that hung over the window. It was filmy, like something seen through water. The strange, undulating waves made the common enough setting of the sun look like a painting in some stoner's gallery. It was as beautiful as it was jarring, and I both hoped for the darkness and feared it. The inmates pressed their faces against the smeary glass and leered at me. They reached their hands through the food flap, but they couldn't get me. I was sprawled against the far wall, my back against the warm stone, and I could see the pool of my own blood that had formed beside me. It hadn't looked too bad, a small puncture in my stomach, but the blood kept flowing as I lay there and held it. I removed my uniform shirt, already stained with dark red, and wrapped it around my stomach like a bandage. I'm not a very big guy. The cheeseburgers haven't quite caught up with me yet, and the shirt made a passable bandage. It stopped the bleeding, for now, but I can still see the blood spreading across the fabric. I'm too much of a coward to inspect the wound, and I don't want to make it worse than it already is. I could hear them outside the door. They're bustling like ants, ever plotting as they make their way and their plans. Every now and again, one of them would look in on me. They would press their face to the glass like a kid at the zoo before losing interest and wandering off again. I watched them back, trying to make note of who came to gawk at me. I would have them then. No more Mr. Nice Guy. I'd see them all on the same block as the guy who stabbed me. My radio crackles frequently. They assembled the response team and prepared to breach the dorm. They were having trouble because after H dorm, another had decided to descend into chaos. I had seen them outside the window, decked out in their riot gear, weapons at the ready when the radio reported F dorm was experiencing similar problems. Then D dorm had followed, their inmates not making it out but trashing the place instead. That's when I saw a bleary line of bodies coming out of F dorm as someone disengaged the locks on their doors. I watched as the team was moving to center gate so they could keep the rioters from breaching the inner ward or getting into the administration area that lay beyond. As they ran for the gate, Control crackled over the walkie to ask if I was 10-4. "Yeah, everything's still 10-4, I returned. "Stay safe, we'll get you out of there." They were right, but their rescue plans were a bit premature. Hour 3. I sat in the dying light and contemplated many things. When we put men in these little cells, we never appreciate how their whole world shrinks. These 4 walls became the borders of my world, and I knew that I was trapped here indefinitely, unless some outside force acted on that door. In my case, this was a good thing. The inmates on the outside would tear me to shreds for the keys on my belt. However, this was likely a very sobering thought for a man lying in this bed at night. He could die in this bed, and no one would notice until morning. You could be locked in here with a dead man till morning, and someone may or may not believe you until they saw the corpse. They kept coming by to gawk at me. In the shadows of the cell, I could see their stretched faces as they wavered behind the glass. I could see their lumpy faces in otherworldly dimensions as they blocked out the light to have a look at me. I was as curious as most of them, but a few of them seemed concerned that I might die. They knew that if I died, they'd be blamed. They knew that if I died, it would add to the time on their sentences. Some of them may even care about my life. Doesn't matter why they come, but they all come to have a peek as they pass their lives in this lockdown. As the time crept closer to 9, a fact I only knew because of the chapel bells that tolled every hour until 10, I began to hear some definite agitation from the world outside. Whoever was in the bubble had turned off the TVs. This may seem like a minor enough inconvenience, but to the inmates, the TV was their only exposure to the world. For many, it was their only joy in life, and the absence of it was very upsetting. To top it off, the unnamed officer had also cut the exhaust fans and the wall-mounted fans. The quad in our old prison was not air-conditioned, something the warden had been fighting to maintain for decades. Without the fan to push air and the exhaust fans to pull the hot air out, it would soon become stifling on the wing. Outside, I could hear the sounds of men yelling, things being thrown, and the sounds of their hellish revelry. I wondered briefly how many other officers were in a similar situation. How many were trapped in a cell, trapped in their officer station, their worlds confined to a box now. For inmates, this may seem normal by now, but to me, a man accustomed to moving about the wide world, it was torture. The men out on the yard, men who were now seeing their worlds grow larger by the minute, were freer now than I. The realization made me feel even more claustrophobic than before. The radio only seemed to make my anxiety worse. The mob had taken over the yard and was now trying to break into one of the quarantine dorms. The special response team was on the scene, but the riot quickly spilled out of control. I could hear gunfire out there and knew there would be a few empty beds come morning. That would be on both sides, I had no doubt. Once they started rioting, it was hard to get them to stop. A few could be put down earlier on, but once the rioters had gotten this far, it would be hard to quiet them with that extreme violence. The radio was silent on my end, no one asking for an update on my situation. I told them all I was 10-4 just so they didn't forget about me, but the growing red stain on my shirt made me think otherwise. Hour 4. As the bell in the chapel told 9, the negotiator approached the flap. I was surprised that it had taken him this long to seek me out. In every situation like this, there's always one person who believes they can talk someone out of their stance. Maybe it's a hostage negotiator, a kidnapper trying to keep his charges quiet, an unwilling participant who thinks they can talk their captor out of this foolish act. There's always one person who thinks they can change the situation with a few well-placed words. A few times, I've been that person, the designated talker who tries to de-escalate the situation. When he smiled at me through the glass, I knew why he was there. We got off on the wrong foot, Sarge. Can we talk? I was leaning against the wall, head pounding as my wound ached. I turned my sweat-soaked face to him and saw some of his resolve slip. I must have looked a fright. Untreated stab wounds don't tend to make you look fresh, though. You want these keys, I rasped, getting straight to the point. He nodded, trying to reset his face as he got a good look at me. There's no way in hell I'm going to give you these keys. You might as well save your breath. And mine. He shook his head like a father who's disappointed with a stubborn child. Be reasonable, Sarge. There's no one up in the station anymore. You've been abandoned, just like us. We might as well help each other out. Thought about it for a minute. Other than the team assembled and moving, I'd seen no attempts to rescue me. My bleeding wasn't getting any worse, but it wasn't getting any better either. Without medical attention, I wasn't going to last long. I was also without food or water in here. I had nothing besides the water in the sink, or the toilet, and who knew what kind of infection I was putting myself at risk to as I lay on the floor and bled from an unbandaged wound. If I could get out of here, I could use my keys in the medical room at the end of the hall and clean and bandage my wound. If I could get out of here, I could surely find a way to the relative safety of the officer station. Maybe it would be best to make a deal. As though to disprove his words, the lights in the cells came on. The harsh fluorescence made me squint as they popped to life, but I smiled despite the discomfort. Those lights had to be turned on by a person. That meant that there was still someone in the station. The negotiator seemed to realize this too, as I grinned my grisly grin in the face of his obvious defeat. Go back and tell your friends it's not going to happen. If you all want these keys, you can figure out how to come in and get them. He shook his head, but to his credit, he didn't lose his cool. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Sarge, was all he said, before finally leaving me to my throbbing stab wound. Hour 5. My radio began to chirp. That was the sound that meant the battery was getting ready to die. The batteries are supposed to have an 8-hour charge, but realistically, you're lucky to get 3 or 4 in before you need to change it. The beeps mean that, with limited use, you had about an hour of battery left. As I lay on the floor in pain, I felt like the little radio might be chirping my life away. It had chosen the perfect time to die, too. The riot was not going well for the prison staff. They were holding Center Gate, but there were likely more inmates than ammunition. I could hear other officers on the radio that were trapped in their stations, trying to figure out what was going on. The inmates of Stragview had taken the inner ward. I didn't need the radio to see that one of the dorms was on fire. One of the dorms on the quarantine had been set ablaze, and with no one to put it out, it was unlikely that the inmates inside would survive. I hoped G-dorm was still secure. G-dorm held the inmates who had been talking the loudest about hurting the quarantine inmates. They had found themselves locked up for the last few weeks for attempting to incite a riot, but it appeared that the riot had come off anyway. If they were allowed to escape confinement, it could get a whole lot worse. The sounds of gunfire were few and far between. and as the riot began to settle in, I started getting sleepy. I know that sounds strange, but as I sat on the dirty floor of that cell, I was getting tired. I lifted a hand, the motion stiff and painful, and slapped my face as hard as I could. I'd lost too much blood to fall asleep. If I fell asleep, I might never wake up again. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton. My tongue stuck to the roof of it. I dragged myself gingerly over to the sink and depressed the silver button that made the water spray out. It arced into the bowl, and I held my hands out eagerly for it. It was cold against my warm skin, and I sloshed it into my mouth eagerly. I collapsed against the floor then, panting. The act of shimmying across the floor and taking a drink had taken a toll on me. I splashed some of the cold water on my face, trying to wake myself up and also trying to quell the heat that had recently sprung up in me. I was sick, feeling the first pangs of infection, but there was nothing to be done for it. The radio crackled to life suddenly, the operator calling out to me for an update. I reached for the radio, my fingertips slapping it dumbly as I slid it over the floor. I caught it before it fell and pulled it to my mouth with an uneasy hand. The radio felt like it weighed about 30 pounds, and when I depressed the button, I thought it might slip out of my hands for a minute. I told Control that I copied and started to tell them that I was fine, but never got the chance. The radio beeped loudly, and the face went blank. I dropped it to the concrete, the box now useless. It was dead. Hour 6. It was getting hard to stay awake. My guts felt like I needed to crap, but all that came out was a lot of foul-smelling air. My vision was getting fuzzy. I've been here for 6 hours, and I only know that little fact because the inmates yelled at another inmate that it was 11 o'clock, so he needed to shut the hell up. I'm still leaning against the wall, arms propped on the toilet, cheeks pressed against the cold steel of the sink. I think my wound may have reopened when I drugged myself over here. I can see it starting to stain the shirt again, the red growing and soaking into the gray as it spreads my lifeblood across the fabric. These notes may be my final statement to the world. I don't believe they have forgotten about me. I believe I may be less of a priority to them than other objectives, though. I can hear scattered gunfire outside, but it doesn't seem to be coming any closer. Someone is shouting through a megaphone, but I can barely make it out. The way the echoes bounce things around in here, it's a wonder anyone can hear anything. As I sit here writing, I'm looking at the wall across from me, and I think my fever might be getting higher than I thought it was. The concrete wall, a wall I know to be solid, keeps rolling like waves on the ocean. I could almost believe that if I were to stick my hand out, I would feel the waves as they roll along. The effect of watching the wall roll like a high tide is dizzying. I wonder if this is why inmates in confinement always seem so squirrely. Do they see this kind of thing so often that they eventually start to believe it's true? I know that the wall is solid, but at the same time, I know what I can see with my own eyes. Am I going crazy? Or is this just the fever? I can't really be sure. Hour 7. I'm lying on the cold concrete floor, watching the most interesting spider. He's built his web under the bed and has somehow avoided getting it destroyed. I see him watching me as I watch him. We seem to be as interested in each other as the other is. Cold concrete feels good on my hot face, and as I write this, I can feel my hands getting heavier and heavier. I can see someone pointing at me through the window. They're talking to someone else, but I can't hear them over the pounding in my ears. I can't remember if that's normal or not. It feels like I've been back here for days. This notebook tells me it's only been 7 hours, but feels like a lot longer. As I'm writing this, a roach has blundered his way into the spider's web. Mr. Spider has begun the process of eating his dinner, and I watch the shiny brown body disappearing into the white coat. The roach struggles against the inevitable, but as he disappears into his new cell, he gets still. Will I grow still too at the end, I wonder? It's quieting down out there. Most of them are going to bed. I can hear them closing their cell doors and settling in. The smart ones are closing their doors, at least. Leaving your door open is a great way to get shot when the National Guard finally gets here. Going to bed sounds like a great idea, actually. I know I shouldn't, but I can barely keep... Hour, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. I don't know what time it is. The ceiling is spinning like a top as I lay here and look at it. I don't know why I'm still writing. My hand moves on its own, it seems. I feel like I'm floating. My stomach throbs in time with my heartbeat. Something is going on outside. I can hear people yelling. Their voices sound so stupid and fragile. They sound like toy soldiers stuck in the mud. The ceiling keeps changing colors as it swirls. It looks like a blacklight poster I saw once in my friend's room. It shifts through the colors as the spiral continues to spin. I can see a light starting to form in the middle of it. I wipe sweat off my forehead. I can feel the flesh against the back of my hand, and I don't like it. It's much, much too warm. Things are making banging noises outside the window. I can hear boots stomping around inside and outside. People are shouting. I don't know what's going on. I'm scared. I want to go home. Hour 10. I wake up to the sound of banging on my door and chimes from the tower signaling chow time. I manage to sit up and make my eyes focus long enough to see that it was the negotiator from earlier. He doesn't look so sure of himself now. There's a big bruise on his cheek, and he looks pretty scared. He keeps swimming in and out of focus, but I don't think that's anything he's doing on purpose. "Sarge," he yells, trying to get my attention. "We need to get out of here. Please give us the keys, and we'll get you some help." I can't muster the focus to speak to him. I manage to flop back to my spot between the toilet and the sink and run some water into my hand. The cool water feels nice, but it's doing nothing to cool me off. I can feel myself sliding sideways again, but the guy yells at me and forces me to come back to some kind of groggy reality. "Sarge, please, you're not going to last much longer. You're the only bargaining chip we have left. Please, we can get you out of here. We can get you some help." I lean against the wall again, blocking him out. I'm not even sure how I'm still writing at this point. I'm tired. I think I'll stop for a while. Hour 11. Someone's out there rolling doors open. I can hear them loud as thunder as they crash open in their metal tracks. People are yelling, but it's all very strange. I'm having trouble feeling my fingers. My arms feel real heavy. My breathing feels watery and my chest feels kind of thick. I think I might be dying, but that's probably wishful thinking. There's no face at my door, but that doesn't mean anything. Maybe they're figuring out how to get into the booth. Maybe they have keys. Who can know? I can hear someone outside the doors, voices raised in anger, and I'm afraid now that they might have figured out how to get in. The door close to mine just slid open with a sound like a landslide. If they come in here, they'll kill me. That may not be such a bad thing, though. My notebook is lying on my lap, and the writing I can see appearing on the page is nearly illegible. I can see the original pool of blood I left. Hello, pool of blood. It's dark red and flaky, but the red streaks I left earlier are still a little wet looking. I can feel my pants. They're tacky with my blood and sticking to me with my pee. I'm surprised I'm still conscious, honestly. Another door rolls open, the one right next to my cell. I can hear someone next door screaming, and the sound of a gun as it crashes in the quiet dorm. A gun? Did the inmates get their hands on some guns? Why would they start killing each other? That's a stupid question. Why do inmates do anything? Well, if they have a gun, at least it'll be quick. There's a bright light on my face. My door is rolling open. I hope it's quick. Hour 12. That's a lie. It's really been about 3 days, but it might as well have been 12 hours. A lot has happened in those 3 days. The men at the door turned out to be the recovery team. While I was hovering on the edge of life, they breached the quad through the fire door and rolled in on the disoriented inmates. I've been told casualties were limited, but I heard someone get shot next door, so who knows? My wound was bad. The knife had pierced something important, and that something had started leaking into my sternum. I had continued bleeding, thanks to the leakage, and the doctor said that if I hadn't been saved, I would likely have died in a few more hours. I had been flushed out, patched up, given antibiotics, and will likely make a full recovery. The warden himself came down to speak with me. He's an odd guy. I've only met him a handful of times, and it's always weird to see him outside the prison. He offered to shake my hand, but I made a half-hearted show of it. He seemed very intent on my story, asking me to recount my experiences for him, as he regarded me with those far too curious eyes. I could swear they gleamed from behind those little glasses he wears, and I told him that I'd lived through it. The prison will, of course, cover my medical bills, and the warden has offered me a commendation for bravery. Bravery. All I did was survive. I didn't tell him about the notes I had. I wanted to keep them so I could see if they matched my memories. The cramped, scrabbly handwriting is just barely legible, and it reads more like the writings of a madman. I'll probably post it along with this story just in case you'd like to read my half-mad ravings. You're probably curious to know why you're reading this at all. The story contains no monsters, no supernatural things, no killers, or anyone other than the guy that tried to stab me, I guess. The story contains a different sort of horror, though. When you're trapped behind the door, your blood running out, you begin to feel that your life is on a stopwatch. It's a sobering feeling, knowing your time is limited. Just because I made it out doesn't mean they all do. So if you decide to go behind the fence, make sure you're ready for whatever those 12 hours have in store for you.